Sorry she died.
Read that again.
Sorry she died.
284 words total in 2 letters, and those are the 3 that matter most, because somebody sat down, thought about how to phrase the death of an 84-year-old woman, and chose an apology. Not a confession. Not a threat.
An apology. Sorry she died.
As if she'd missed a flight. As if a package got lost. That single word, sorry, is doing more work in this case than almost anything the Pima County Sheriff's Department has said out loud in 6 months. And tonight we are going to take it apart, sentence by sentence, comma by comma, because the 2 ransom notes connected to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie may be the only physical trace of the person who took her that investigators actually have in hand. Confirmed, Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of Today's Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, vanished from her home in Tucson, Arizona, on February 1st. Confirmed, a note arrived at a Tucson television station on February 2nd, addressed to Savannah by name, demanding $4 million in Bitcoin. Confirmed, a second note arrived 4 days later, on February 6th, and this one didn't ask for money. This one said she was already gone. Alleged, because nothing here is proven until a lab, a judge, or a confession makes it so, that the same person wrote both. Alleged, that the notes are even telling the truth about what happened to her at all. Held, because we are not going to pretend we know more than we do, whether Nancy Guthrie is alive tonight, in a location investigators haven't found, or whether the second note is the only honest sentence the sender ever wrote. If you want to follow along as we go through this, subscribe to this channel because we're going to be tracking every development in this case as it breaks, and there is a lot still coming. Before we get to the words themselves, you need the minutes because the minutes are what make the words mean anything at all. Confirmed, from the sheriff's own department, Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home near East Skyline Drive and North Campbell Avenue by her own children at approximately 9:45 on the night of Saturday, January 31st. She said goodnight. They drove away. That is the last confirmed sighting of her by anyone who loved her. Confirmed. The doorbell camera at that home disconnected at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. Not malfunctioned in some ambiguous, could be anything way. Disconnected at a specific, logged, time-stamped moment, which is exactly the kind of digital evidence that doesn't lie about when it happened even when everything else about a case is still murky. Confirmed, and this is the detail that should stop every single person listening to this in their tracks. Nancy Guthrie wore a pacemaker, and that pacemaker communicated wirelessly with her phone, the way modern cardiac devices do, constantly, quietly, in the background of an ordinary life nobody thinks about until it becomes evidence. At approximately 2:30 that same morning, the pacemaker's signal disconnected from her phone, indicating the device had moved out of range. There's a practical reason all of this linguistic and behavioral profiling matters beyond intellectual curiosity, and it has to do with a number Sheriff Nanos himself has cited publicly, tens of thousands of tips, accumulated over 6 months of national attention on this case. That volume is simultaneously the investigation's greatest asset and its heaviest burden, because every single one of those tips has to be logged, triaged, and evaluated by a finite number of investigators working finite hours, and the overwhelming majority of any tip line's volume in a high-profile case turns out to be well-meaning but ultimately unconnected noise. People reporting a resemblance they saw at a gas station, a gut feeling about a neighbor, a dream they had. Sorting a genuinely useful lead out of that volume is, itself, an enormous investigative task, and this is precisely where a detailed linguistic and behavioral profile earns its keep beyond mere entertainment value. A tip that says simply, "I think I saw something suspicious," carries far less triage value than a tip that says, "My coworker always writes smartwatch as 2 words and once described a relative's death as buried in nature," because the second tip arrives pre-filtered against a specific, documented pattern investigators already know to weight heavily. That's the actual, functional purpose behind walking through 284 words this closely for this long tonight, not simply to satisfy curiosity about who might have written them, but to hand every person watching a sharper, more specific filter to run their own memory through before they ever pick up the phone, so that when the call comes in, it arrives already carrying the kind of specificity that moves it toward the top of an overwhelmed investigator's pile rather than the bottom. Sit with that sequence for a second, because most true crime coverage glosses right past it to get to the more cinematic details, the ransom demand, the Bitcoin, the blood on the porch, and in doing so it skips over what might be the single most objective, least arguable piece of evidence in this entire case. A doorbell camera going dark at 1:47 a.m. A medical implant losing contact with a paired device at 2:30 a.m. 43 minutes apart. That is not a coincidence, and it is not the kind of detail either side of this argument, the true crime armchair analysts or the professional investigators, can spin into something else, because a pacemaker doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't perform. It doesn't choose its words to manipulate a grieving family. It just transmits a signal, or it doesn't, and at 2:30 in the morning it stopped. That 43-minute window between the camera going dark and the pacemaker going out of range is, as close as this case may ever get to it, a time-stamped record of exactly how long it took for whoever did this to move an 84-year-old woman from inside that house to somewhere far enough away, or shielded enough, that a low-power medical signal could no longer reach her phone. 43 minutes tells you something about distance, about whether a vehicle was involved, about whether this was rushed or whether it was methodical. It is the closest thing this investigation has to a stopwatch, and it started running before either ransom note existed. This isn't the first time a wireless medical device has ended up doing forensic work its manufacturer never designed it for, and the precedent is worth knowing because it establishes exactly how seriously courts have already come to take this category of evidence. In 2016, a house fire in Middletown, Ohio, led investigators to a homeowner named Ross Compton, who told police he'd woken to the flames, broken his bedroom window with a cane, packed several bags and a suitcase, and carried them out to his car, all before escaping the burning structure himself. Investigators obtained a warrant for the data recorded by Compton's own pacemaker in the minutes surrounding the fire, his heart rate, his cardiac rhythm, the demand placed on the device before, during, and after the blaze, and had a cardiologist review it against his account. The cardiologist's conclusion was blunt. Given his documented medical conditions, it was highly improbable he could have physically performed everything he described, collecting and carrying that much weight, breaking out a window, in the time frame his own story required. He was indicted on arson and insurance fraud charges, and a judge ultimately ruled the pacemaker data was admissible, in what's widely regarded as the first American criminal case built in part on evidence generated by a person's own beating heart. That ruling matters here for a simple reason. It establishes, as settled legal precedent, that wireless medical telemetry isn't a novelty or a gray area anymore. It's evidence. Courts have already said so, and the same category of data, a device silently, continuously recording and transmitting biological information whether its owner thinks about it or not, sits at the center of the Guthrie timeline too, except in this case it isn't contradicting a suspect's alibi. It's marking, to the minute, the last moment Nancy Guthrie's own body was close enough to her phone to be heard. Now overlay that against what the notes claim. The first note describes her as safe but scared, held for ransom, to be released unharmed once payment clears. If the pacemaker timeline is accurate, and there's no meaningful reason to doubt digital telemetry logged by a paired medical device, then whoever wrote that first note, whether it's the person who physically took her or someone relaying information from that person, was describing a woman who had, less than 24 hours earlier, been moved out of her home in the dead of night by force, without her medication, without her hearing aids, without her glasses, in a manner violent enough to leave blood at the point of exit. Safe but scared is doing an enormous amount of softening in that sentence. It's the kind of phrase you write when you need the family to keep believing a peaceful outcome is still possible, keep believing cooperation is still the rational choice, keep sending money instead of calling in every resource the federal government has. It's persuasion dressed up as reassurance, and the pacemaker data, cold and mechanical and utterly indifferent to anyone's narrative, suggests the reality on the ground that night looked nothing like safe. There's a detail in the earliest reporting on this case that deserves more weight than it usually gets, precisely because it sounds small next to Bitcoin and blood evidence and pacemaker telemetry, and that's the specific list of what she was taken without. No shoes, no glasses, no hearing aids, no watch, no medication. Strip those away from an 84-year-old woman, all at once, in the middle of the night, and you haven't just inconvenienced her, you've functionally disabled several of the systems she relies on to understand and navigate the world around her. Without glasses, a visually compromised environment becomes disorienting in ways a sighted captor may not even register as significant. Without hearing aids, spoken communication, threats, instructions, reassurance, whatever was said to her in whatever location she was taken to would have arrived muffled, partial, possibly incomprehensible, compounding fear with confusion in a way that makes compliance harder to secure through communication and easier to secure through pure physical control instead. Without a cane or the stable footing shoes provide, mobility itself becomes a liability, increasing dependence on whoever is controlling the situation. None of that reads as a calculated cruelty checklist necessarily. It may simply reflect the chaos and speed of an abduction executed in minutes, in the dark, by someone not thinking carefully about what she'd need to survive. But whether it was deliberate or careless, the effect is the same, and it's worth naming directly. Whoever did this created, whether through malice or through simple failure to think it through, a level of sensory and physical vulnerability that would have made Nancy Guthrie almost entirely dependent on the goodwill of a person who had already demonstrated, through blood evidence at her own front door, a willingness to use force against her. It's worth stepping back for a moment and asking a question the cable coverage rarely slows down long enough to address directly. Why an 84-year-old woman, specifically, and what that choice, if it was a choice at all rather than pure opportunity, says about whoever made it. Elder abduction and exploitation cases follow patterns that differ meaningfully from abductions of younger victims, and law enforcement training around elder crimes has developed an entire vocabulary for describing why offenders target this population specifically. Elderly victims living alone or with reduced physical capacity present a lower perceived risk of physical resistance. Medical conditions, the kind that require a pacemaker, hearing aids, glasses, daily medication, create a built-in vulnerability window, a victim who becomes measurably more fragile, more dependent, more urgent to recover, the longer they're separated from routine care, which is precisely the kind of leverage a person planning an extortion scheme might factor into a calculated risk-reward assessment. High public profile within a family, in this case a nationally recognizable daughter, adds a financial dimension that a random elderly victim wouldn't carry, transforming an act of elder abuse into a calculated, high-value extortion target. None of that requires the offender to have known Nancy Guthrie personally in any deep sense. It only requires them to have known or discovered that combination of factors: low physical resistance capacity, high-value family connections, and a specific, describable home layout, and to have made a deliberate choice to exploit all three at once. It's worth placing Nancy Guthrie's case inside the wider pattern federal researchers have already documented about crimes against elderly Americans, not because statistics solve individual cases, they don't, but because they explain why the investigative instincts several experts on this broadcast have already reached for: caregiver access, familiarity with routine, exploitation of physical vulnerability, aren't speculative leaps. They're the documented norm. National elder abuse research consistently finds that the substantial majority of reported abuse, neglect, and exploitation involving people over 65 is committed not by strangers, but by someone already known to the victim, a family member, a caregiver, an acquaintance with legitimate or semi-legitimate access to their daily life. Precisely because that access is what makes the crime logistically possible in the first place, a stranger off the street simply doesn't know which elderly homeowner has a predictable schedule, a specific medical vulnerability, and a security system with an exploitable blind spot. That pattern holds specifically in financial exploitation cases too, the closest legal cousin to a ransom scheme, where perpetrators known to the victim are overwhelmingly more common than anonymous scammers because trust, once established, functions as a far more efficient tool for accessing an elderly victim's assets, routines, and vulnerabilities than any amount of external surveillance could replicate. None of that data identifies a specific person in this case. What it does is validate, with real, replicated research rather than instinct alone, the direction nearly every credentialed voice on this broadcast has independently pointed toward tonight. Not a stranger who read about a wealthy family in a magazine, but someone whose relationship to Nancy Guthrie's ordinary, daily, unremarkable life made this crime possible in the first place. This is also, and it deserves to be said plainly, one of the starkest arguments against the theory that this was some kind of opportunistic wandering incident, an elderly woman confused in the night, lost, unaccompanied. Confusion doesn't disable a doorbell camera 43 minutes before a pacemaker moves out of range of a paired phone. Confusion doesn't correlate two separate pieces of unrelated home and medical technology into a single, tight window. What correlates two unrelated technologies into a single tight window is a person moving her, deliberately, away from the range of both devices in a controlled, continuous sequence. The sheriff's department has treated this as a kidnapping from very early in the investigation, and whatever else is uncertain about this case, the pacemaker telemetry is one of the pieces of evidence that makes that classification almost impossible to argue against in good faith. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and I mean strange in a way that should bother you if you've been half listening to press conferences and moving on with your day. 24 hours, roughly, before Sheriff Chris Nanos released that second note publicly, a reporter asked him a direct question on camera, "Is Nancy Guthrie alive?" And his answer, word for word, was this: "I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note. No note." He said no note. Then, less than a day later, he releases a note. A note where the alleged kidnappers say she died of natural causes and is buried in nature. So, either the sheriff was sitting on information he chose not to share with the public while denying its existence on camera, or something happened in that 24-hour window that changed the entire trajectory of what investigators were willing to say. Neither one of those options is comfortable. Both of them deserve scrutiny, and we're going to give it to them, but first, we have to go back to the words themselves, because the words are where this case may actually get solved. There's a piece of this story that lives entirely outside the notes themselves, and it belongs here because it explains why so much public trust in this investigation eroded before a single word of forensic linguistics ever entered the conversation. Watch Sheriff Nanos across multiple appearances, side by side, and a pattern starts to surface that has nothing to do with what he says and everything to do with how he says it. There's a particular register he shifts into when a camera is rolling and a question gets uncomfortable, a slower cadence, a more deliberate pause before each sentence, the visual equivalent of someone choosing every word with more care than the moment naturally calls for. It is, in the words of one panelist watching that same footage, his serious face, a phrase that sounds dismissive on its own but is actually pointing at something real, the gap between a performance of gravity and an actual disclosure of information. Compare that register to the flat, almost offhand way he answered the direct question about whether Nancy Guthrie might be dead. "I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note." No pause. No visible weight. Delivered with the cadence of someone reciting a checklist rather than someone carrying the knowledge that a note describing exactly that outcome may already have crossed his desk. Crime Stories investigative reporter Dave Mack, who has covered this case from the ground in Tucson, put the contradiction as bluntly as it can be put. Did he just say, "I don't have a body, I don't have a burial site, I don't have a note"? And then 24 hours, bam, he releases the note saying she's dead. Mack's read isn't just that the timing is suspicious, it's that the register never changed to match it. A sheriff who had just 24 hours earlier flatly denied possessing a document describing a woman's death did not, in his account of releasing that same document a day later, visibly reckon with the size of that reversal. He actually says no, Mack notes. That's what kind of got me more than anything, the casualness of the denial sitting uncomfortably next to the gravity of what followed it. When a public official's effect doesn't move even as the facts underneath him move dramatically, that's not proof of concealment on its own. People process trauma and pressure differently. Some flatten under stress rather than crack. But it is exactly the kind of behavioral inconsistency that trained interviewers are taught to flag and revisit, not because it proves anything by itself, but because it tells you where to look harder. There's also a pattern worth naming in how Nanos discusses the FBI relationship specifically, because it recurs across multiple settings with almost identical phrasing. "It's a good relationship. It's always been a good relationship." Said, notably, in response to a question that wasn't really about the general health of the partnership, but about a specific, concrete decision, whether the fastest available lab Quantico, was used or passed over in favor of a slower option. Redirecting a specific question about a specific choice into a general, reassuring statement about the overall relationship is a classic verbal pivot. One media training programs teach explicitly, answer the question you wish had been asked rather than the one that was. It's not evidence of wrongdoing. It is evidence of message discipline and message discipline. In a case where a family is desperate for straight answers about whether the fastest possible forensic resources were actually used, reads very differently than it would in a routine press briefing about budget allocations. Notice, too, the method behind everything we've walked through so far because it's worth naming out loud rather than leaving it implied. Every conclusion in this breakdown traces back to a primary source, the sheriff's own on-camera statements, footage recovered from a doorbell camera, the verbatim text of 2 ransom notes, court records from a separate imposter prosecution, published forensic and behavioral analysis from named, credentialed experts. When Sheriff Nano said, "I have nothing to indicate she's dead," that claim gets checked against tape, against the specific words used, against what came out roughly 24 hours later, not against a vague memory of a press conference summarized secondhand. That habit, going back to the actual footage, the actual transcript, the actual document, rather than accepting a paraphrase or a headline as sufficient, is the entire discipline this breakdown is built on, and it's the same discipline that turns a passing cable news impression into something closer to an actual case file. It's slower. It's less satisfying in the moment than simply declaring a verdict and moving on. But it's the only method that produces conclusions sturdy enough to survive contact with whatever comes next in this investigation: an arrest, a confession, a body, a name, rather than conclusions that collapse the first time someone actually goes back and checks the tape. Words mean things. Keep that phrase in your head, because we're going to return to it more than once tonight, and by the end you'll understand why a cybersecurity investigator who trained FBI agents used almost that exact sentence to explain why he doesn't trust these letters. Words mean things, and the person who wrote these particular words left behind more of themselves than they probably realize. Let's start with the sequence, because sequence matters. The first note surfaces February 2nd, one day after Nancy Guthrie disappears from her home in the middle of the night, taken without her shoes, without her glasses, without her hearing aids, without her watch, and without the medication an 84-year-old woman would need to survive more than a few days. That detail alone should stop you. Whoever did this either didn't think about what she'd need to live, or didn't care, and there is a canyon of difference between those two possibilities. The note opens with "Hello, Savannah." Not "Dear Ms. Guthrie." Not a demand barked at a faceless family. "Hello, Savannah," like a greeting between people who already know each other, or at least like someone performing familiarity they haven't earned. Forensic linguists will tell you that greeting choice is one of the first things they look at because it tells you how the writer positions themselves relative to the victim's family. A stranger extorting a stranger doesn't usually open with a first name and a soft hello. They open with a demand. This person opened with intimacy. That's a choice, and every choice in a ransom note is a fingerprint, even when there isn't a literal fingerprint anywhere on the paper. The note goes on. "We have your mother. She's safe but scared. She will be held for ransom. Once payment is received, she will be released unharmed. For $1 million in Bitcoin before 5 p.m. on the 5th. And then the sentence, tucked in almost casually. You need to send Bitcoin in the amount of $4 million US. Before we even get to what USD reveals about the writer, it's worth asking the more basic question of why Bitcoin at all, rather than cash, wire transfer, or any of the older ransom mechanisms that dominated this kind of crime for most of the 20th century. The answer is less about anonymity, which, as we'll get to shortly, is largely a myth, and more about speed and irreversibility. A cash drop requires a physical handoff, a location, a moment of maximum exposure where a courier or the offender themselves has to be physically present and physically vulnerable to surveillance or interception, which is exactly the moment that has ended more kidnapping schemes throughout history than almost any other single failure point. A wire transfer runs through a bank, which means a compliance department, a fraud detection algorithm, and a subpoena process that can freeze funds before they're ever accessed. Bitcoin, once it clears the blockchain, is effectively irreversible. No bank can claw it back, No third party can freeze it retroactively without controlling the private keys themselves, which makes it, on the surface, an appealing instrument for someone who has seen enough true crime television to believe cryptocurrency solves the physical handoff problem that has doomed extortionists for a century. What that same person typically doesn't understand, and what Jim Clemente's read of this offender as performing sophistication without achieving it would predict, is that irreversibility and traceability are two completely separate properties. And choosing the first while remaining ignorant of the second is exactly the kind of half-informed criminal decision that looks clever in the moment and becomes a liability the instant investigators start watching a wallet address instead of a drop-off.
Point.
USD. Stop and sit with that for a second, because it is one of the strangest word choices in the entire document. If you are an American writing a ransom note to an American family in America demanding American dollars, you don't specify USD. You just say dollars, or you just say the number. Nobody standing in a Tucson gas station says, "That'll be $43 USD, please." The only people who habitually clarify the currency are people who are used to thinking in more than one currency, people for whom dollars is ambiguous because they deal in Canadian dollars, Australian dollars, or some other denomination in their daily life, or people translating from a language where the currency needs to be specified because the target audience isn't assumed to default to American money. That single acronym, 3 letters, is doing enormous work. It is either a linguistic tell about who this person is, or it's a deliberate plant designed to make investigators chase a fake nationality while the real author sits 3 miles from the crime scene laughing about it. Both are live possibilities. We are not going to pretend otherwise. But it cannot be ignored, because it's exactly the kind of detail that, cross-referenced against other evidence down the road, either confirms or destroys a suspect's story in about 4 seconds. There's a logistical detail buried in the middle of the first note that gets far less attention than the currency clarification or the ellipsis, and it deserves equal weight because it's a promise with a specific, checkable shape. Once payments received to the Bitcoin address, she will be released within 12 hours to a safe drop-off location back in Tucson. Read that sentence like a plan rather than a threat for a moment, because that's what it is, a logistical commitment, and logistical commitments reveal geography the way vocabulary reveals background. Back in Tucson implies she would, in this scenario, be held somewhere outside the city limits before being returned to it, which tells you the writer was thinking in terms of an actual physical operation, a location to hold her, a route back into the metro area, a drop-off point specific enough to plan around but vague enough not to compromise the operation if the note were intercepted, which of course it was. A stranger improvising a crime of opportunity in a moment of chaos does not typically have a return logistics plan already sketched out within 24 hours of the abduction. Someone thinking clearly enough to specify a 12-hour release window and a return to Tucson drop-off, while simultaneously specifying a Bitcoin deadline 5 days out, was thinking in terms of an actual operational sequence, not a single desperate act. Which makes the total collapse of that plan for days later, replaced by a claim of natural death and a body supposedly already in nature, worth sitting with on its own terms. Either the operational plan described in Note 1 was real, and something happened between February 2nd and February 6th that made it impossible to execute, a death the writer didn't anticipate, a captor who lost control of the situation, law enforcement pressure that made a physical handoff too risky to attempt, or the 12-hour release promise in Note 1 was never real to begin with. Theater designed to buy time and cooperation from a family desperate enough to believe a peaceful resolution remained possible. Both readings are consistent with everything else in this case. But the specificity of that logistics line, a return location, a release window, is exactly the kind of detail an investigator would want to build a geographic profile around, because back in Tucson implies currently not in Tucson, or at least not in a location the writer considered part of Tucson in casual usage. And that single preposition might be doing more work in narrowing a search radius than an entire page of psychological analysis. One more line in that first note deserves its own pass before we move on, because it's easy to read past it as filler between the bigger reveals. Once payment is received, she will be released unharmed. Unharmed. Not safe. Not returned. Unharmed. A word that speaks directly and only to the absence of physical injury, and it's worth noticing that it appears in the same paragraph as "she's safe but scared," Two claims about her physical and emotional condition offered with confident specificity by someone who, if the pacemaker timeline is accurate, would have had to be actively monitoring her well after any initial struggle at the doorway in order to make either claim honestly. A stranger relaying secondhand information, or someone who lost direct contact with her shortly after the abduction, couldn't respond to, is she unharmed, with that kind of unqualified certainty. Someone who could, whether that certainty turned out to be true or not, was asserting ongoing, current access to her condition, which narrows the range of plausible scenarios yet again toward a single person, or a small, coordinated group, maintaining actual physical custody rather than someone operating at a remove from wherever she was actually being held. Then there's the ellipsis. Your mother is aware of this, and her life is in your hands. Forensic document examiners will tell you punctuation habits are almost as individual as handwriting because most people never think about their punctuation. They just do what feels natural over and over, the same way every single time, across years of emails and texts and notes nobody was ever supposed to analyze. An ellipsis in that spot is not neutral. It's theatrical. It's meant to hang in the air, to let the threat breathe before the letter moves on to physical description. A white smartwatch left on the floor at the foot of the bed, a floodlight in the backyard that had been destroyed. Those two details are the parts of the note that read the most like proof of life, or proof of presence, evidence that whoever wrote this was actually inside that house, actually saw that bedroom, actually walked through that backyard. And notice what the note does not include. No photograph, no lock of hair, no swab, no scrap of clothing, nothing that could be tested for DNA in a lab within 48 hours. Just a description of a room. Anyone with information from inside that house, whether they were there the night she vanished or heard about it secondhand from someone who could have produced those same two sentences. But before we move to the second note, there's a wrinkle in this story that most casual followers of the case never fully absorbed, and it matters enormously for how carefully you should weigh everything else in this letter. In the days immediately following the first note's release, a man named Derek Anthony Colella was arrested and charged federally, one count of intent to transmit a demand for ransom, one count of using a telecommunications device to anonymously threaten or harass a person. For a window of time, it looked like the case might already be cracking open, like investigators had moved from zero to an arrest in record speed. Then came the correction. Quieter than the arrest had been loud. Federal investigators confirmed Colella was not responsible for the earlier ransom demand sent to local media, the one addressed "Hello, Savannah," the one we just spent the last several minutes taking apart. He was an imposter, someone who saw a national tragedy unfolding in real time and tried to extract his own payday from a grieving family's desperation, a parasite attaching himself to someone else's nightmare. He was not the author of the notes actually connected to this case. A federal judge later ordered him into inpatient treatment ahead of sentencing. Why does that matter here, tonight, in a breakdown about linguistics and psychology and blood evidence? Because it's a live demonstration of exactly how easily a case like this can generate false signal, and it's a warning against assuming every piece of ransom-adjacent communication that surfaces in a high-profile disappearance is connected to the actual crime. Colella's fraudulent messages, whatever they said, are now a permanent contaminant in the public record of this case, a second, unrelated voice that had to be identified and separated out from the real one before investigators, or we, could trust any conclusion built on the authentic notes. Around the same time, a separate man, Carlos Palazuelos, was stopped during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, questioned in connection with the disappearance, and released by midnight, without charges. He is not, based on everything publicly reported, a suspect today. We name him only because his name is already part of the public record of this investigation, and because leaving him out while discussing everyone else who brushed against this case would create exactly the kind of incomplete picture we're trying to avoid. Two men, two entirely different roles in this story. One a confirmed fraud who exploited the family's fear for money he was never going to get to keep. One a person of momentary interest who was cleared and released. Neither one wrote, "Hello, Savannah." Neither one wrote, "Sorry, she died." Whoever did remains, as of tonight, unnamed, And every piece of noise generated by cases like Kalela's makes the job of isolating the real author's voice that much harder and that much more important to get right. Now, the second note, 4 days later, February 6th, and the tone shift here is the single most important thing about this entire case, because tone shift is exactly what forensic psychologists are trained to flag as a moment when the writer's real state of mind leaks through the performance. Compare the openings. Note 1. Hello, Savannah. Confident, casual, in control. Note 2 opens instead with an excuse. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical condition. That's not a greeting. That's a defense attorney's opening statement. It's mitigation before the bad news has even been delivered. Read the next lines slowly. We never intended to hurt her. That was not our intention. Watch what just happened there. The same idea, said twice, back to back, separated only by a comma. We never intended to hurt her, comma. That was not our intention. That construction has a name. It's called a comma splice. 2 complete statements jammed together with a comma instead of a period or a conjunction, and on its own, a comma splice is nothing. Everyone does it occasionally. You've probably done it in a text message today. But here it isn't occasional. It's a pattern, it repeats, and one of the forensic analysts we're about to hear from says she has literally put a defendant in prison off the back of exactly this habit before in an unrelated case, because comma splicing under stress is one of those tics that survives even when a writer is trying very hard to sound calm. Then the note delivers the actual news, and it delivers it in the most passive language available in the English language. She perished shortly after she was taken. We believe it was heart-related. She is buried in nature. Read those 3 sentences and count how many times an actual human being is named as the one who did anything to her. 0. She perished, as if death arrived on its own, uninvited, with no relationship whatsoever to the fact that she'd been dragged out of her bed at 84 years old without her medication, her hearing aids, or her glasses, and held somewhere for days. We believe it was heart-related. Not we believe we caused this. Not even we think this happened because of what we did. Just a clinical, distanced guess, phrased the way you'd phrase a rumor you heard about a stranger. And buried in nature, maybe the strangest 4 words in the whole document, because nobody actually talks that way. People say buried in the desert, buried in the woods, buried out back. In nature is a phrase that sounds translated or performed or lifted from somewhere the writer thought sounded appropriately solemn without actually being a phrase they'd use if you sat them down and asked them, off the cuff, where a body goes when somebody puts it in the ground. The note closes with one more line that deserves its own moment. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. On its face, that reads like comfort. It reads like someone trying to be kind to a grieving family. But turn it around and listen to what it's actually doing. It is preemptively closing off every question about intervention, about rescue, about whether faster police work or a faster ransom payment might have saved her. It answers a question nobody asked, which is exactly the kind of thing people say when they are trying to get ahead of blame before blame arrives. And then, the very last word of the letter. Sorry. There's a motive question sitting underneath the entire structure of the second note that deserves to be asked directly rather than absorbed passively as background noise. Why abandon $4 million? Whoever wrote the first note went to considerable trouble to establish a working extortion scheme, a Bitcoin address, a specific deadline, a described release plan, and whoever wrote or authorized the second note walked all of that away from entirely, replacing a live financial demand with a claim of death and an apology. In pure self-interested criminal terms, that's an enormous, almost incomprehensible sacrifice, unless one of a small number of things is true. Either the money was never actually the primary motive, and whatever this was, the ransom framing was cover for something else entirely: anger, a personal grievance against the family, an attempt at control that spiraled beyond what was intended. Or something happened between February 2nd and February 6th that made continuing the financial extortion impossible or too dangerous. Law enforcement pressure closing in faster than anticipated, a death that genuinely wasn't planned, and that panicked whoever was responsible into abandoning the scheme before it could be completed. Or, in the coldest possible reading, the second note was never really about honesty at all, but but about strategically cutting losses, calculating that a sympathetic, remorseful death narrative was less legally and practically risky to maintain than continuing an active extortion scheme that federal investigators were now fully mobilized against, with a fixed-wing aircraft on a runway and a task force actively working the case. Each of those three readings implies a meaningfully different person on the other end of that pen, and it's worth noticing that the psychological experts on this broadcast, Marshall and Miller both, lean toward the middle reading, panic and genuine remorse following an unplanned death, based on the repetition, the apparent need to be understood, the apology closing out the letter. Jim Clemente's amateur offender read supports that same middle theory, an inexperienced person whose plan derailed faster than they anticipated, forcing an improvised pivot rather than an executed strategy. Morgan Wright's skepticism culls toward the third, colder reading, a calculated retreat dressed in emotional language. What almost nobody on this broadcast seriously entertains is the first reading, that the money was covered from the very beginning, and that's worth noting too, because if that theory turns out to be correct, it would mean this entire linguistic analysis, built on the assumption of a financially motivated offender who lost control of their own scheme, is chasing the wrong shape of person entirely, and the real motive, whatever grievance or obsession actually drove this, still hasn't been named by anyone, including the investigators, out loud. Compare that closing word against the note's own title for itself. In effect, the very first line of the second letter. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical condition. That's a sentence built entirely out of institutional, almost clinical distance, the language of a liability waiver rather than a person describing another human being's suffering. The letter opens in the register of an insurance adjuster and closes in the register of a person who can no longer maintain that distance. Something happens across those few hundred words, some erosion of the performance the writer started with, and by the time sorry lands on its own line at the very end, the note has traveled the full distance between those two registers, bureaucratic minimization at the start, something closer to genuine human weight at the finish. That arc, that specific emotional trajectory across a single short document, is itself a kind of evidence, harder to fake convincingly than any individual word choice, because sustaining a false emotional arc across an entire letter under real psychological pressure is considerably more difficult than simply misspelling a word or choosing an unusual phrase on purpose.
Sorry.
One word, alone on its own line, no subject, no verb, nothing attached to it. It's the word this entire case may turn on, because an apology is not something extortionists include. Extortionists want money. They want leverage. They do not typically apologize to the people they are actively threatening, because an apology implies remorse, and remorse implies a relationship to the harm that a professional criminal, someone doing this purely for $4 million in Bitcoin, doesn't usually feel the need to perform. Somebody wrote sorry and meant, on some level, for it to be believed. Position in a document carries its own forensic weight, separate from the word itself, and it's a principle forensic linguists rely on constantly when analyzing threatening or confessional correspondence. The final line of any written statement functions differently than anything that precedes it because it's the sentence a writer chooses to leave the reader with, the last impression, the thought given the most deliberate weight in the entire composition, whether the writer consciously recognizes that instinct in themselves or not. People close eulogies with their truest sentiment. They close arguments with their strongest point. They close confessions, when they write them at all, with whatever feeling they most need the reader to walk away holding. A calculating extortionist closing a letter with a final demand, a final threat, a final instruction, is behaving exactly as you'd expect. A person closing a letter describing an elderly woman's death with a single, isolated word of apology is doing something else entirely, positioning their own need to be forgiven as the last thing they want this family to carry away from the worst news they will ever receive. That placement, last word, own line, no elaboration, is not incidental. It's the closest thing to an unguarded moment this entire correspondence contains, the one instant where the performance of a controlled, methodical operation seems to slip, however briefly, into something that reads like a genuine human being confronting, even if only for a sentence, the size of what they'd actually done. If any of this is landing with you, You're starting to see how much information is actually buried inside 2 short paragraphs, and it only gets denser from here once we bring in the people trained to read it professionally. Let's bring in the person who's spent her career reading letters exactly like these. Lisa Miller is a former detective, a former chief investigator, and a former senior executive in the Colorado Attorney General's office, and she's built a career on the idea that criminals reveal themselves in writing whether they mean to or not. Her first instinct, before she'd read both notes side by side, was that 2 different people had written them, because the emotional register is so different. Note 1 cold and transactional, Note 2 soft and self-justifying. But then she did what any good analyst does. She stopped reacting to tone and started counting patterns. And the patterns told a different story than the tone did. Both notes originated from the same IP address. That alone is a serious piece of evidence, the kind that narrows a suspect pool from anyone on Earth to someone with access to one specific internet connection or one specific piece of infrastructure, and it's already something investigators can subpoena, trace, and build a timeline around. But Miller's sharper find is stylistic, and it's the kind of detail that a casual reader, someone skimming the notes on their phone between meetings, would sail right past without noticing. Both letters use what she calls open compounds, where the overwhelming majority of English speakers use closed ones. Smartwatch. 2 words, when almost everybody writes smartwatch, 1 word. Floodlight. 2 words, when almost everybody writes floodlight, 1 word, or, at minimum, hyphenates it. Heart-related. No hyphen at all, when standard usage calls for heart-related. On their own, any single one of these is nothing. A typo, an autocorrect quirk. But 3 of them, spread across 2 notes written 4 days apart, all leaning the same direction, all splitting words that native, habitual writers tend to fuse together. Miller calls that stylistic leakage, the idea that under the pressure of trying to disguise your own voice, trying to sound like someone else, trying to sound calm when you are anything but, your actual habits slip through the cracks anyway. You can disguise your intent. It is much harder to disguise your muscle memory. Miller doesn't ask you to trust her instinct on faith alone, and she shouldn't have to, because she's built her career on a specific, documented example of exactly this method working in a courtroom. Long before this case, she prosecuted a bank robbery where the physical evidence connecting a suspect to the crime was thin, largely circumstantial, built off a witness, not even an eyewitness to the robbery itself, but someone who knew a little about what the robber had been wearing beforehand. Stylistically, the kind of secondhand detail that rarely holds up on its own in front of a jury. What turned that case wasn't a fingerprint or a security camera. It was a note the robber had left behind at the scene, a note Miller still keeps framed from the trial, for words that became the spine of the state's argument. Don't touch, the alarm. Read that construction again, slowly, the way a jury eventually had to. A normal, urgent instruction, in a moment of maximum stress, robbing a bank, adrenaline running, would come out as one continuous command. Don't touch the alarm. No pauses. No punctuation a person would consciously insert while committing a felony in real time. But this robber's note broke the sentence apart with commas in a place no fluent, unself-conscious writer would ever naturally place them, a pattern consistent, it turned out, with a specific, documented processing difference in how the writer's brain organized written language, information that came out later during the investigation and that lined up precisely with the eventual identification of the suspect. Miller tracked the witness down to, of all places, the Fulton County Jail, had the eventual suspect submit to a formal handwriting analysis, and built a known writing sample she could compare directly against the note left at the scene. The punctuation held. The phrasing held. And a case that had looked, on paper, unwinnable off circumstantial testimony alone turned, in the end, on 4 words and an oddly placed comma. That use of commas turned the case, Miller says, flatly, and it's not an anecdote she tells for color. It's the entire methodological foundation for how she's approaching the Guthrie notes right now. A criminal in the middle of committing or confessing to a crime is not thinking about their punctuation. They're thinking about the crime, about getting the message across, about controlling the reader's reaction. Punctuation habits live below that level of conscious control, which is exactly why they survive intact even when everything else about a person's voice is being deliberately disguised. The comma splices in the second Guthrie note. We never intended to hurt her, comma. That was not our intention. Aren't stylistic flourishes chosen for effect? In Miller's Red, informed directly by a case, she has already won on precisely this kind of evidence. They are the exact fingerprint category that has closed cases before, sitting in plain sight, waiting for the right known sample to compare them against. She's careful, and we should be careful right alongside her, because both notes are short, and short samples make definitive conclusions dangerous. You cannot build an airtight profile off 2 paragraphs the way you might off a 35,000-word manifesto. But careful doesn't mean toothless. Careful means the conclusion holds until better evidence knocks it down, and right now, the best linguistic evidence available points toward one author, writing under stress, leaking small, consistent tells about how their brain organizes language on the page. Now bring in a second expert, because good investigation doesn't rely on one voice. It stress tests a theory against people trained to look for different things. Dr. Bethany Marshall is a psychoanalyst, the author of Deal Breaker, a fixture on Peacock, Hulu, and Bravo, and the host of her own podcast, On the Couch with Dr. Bethany Marshall, and where Lisa Miller reads syntax, Bethany Marshall reads motive. Her read on the second note centers on repetition. We have your mother, Nancy. She perished. She's in nature. 3 short declarative bursts, stacked one after another, and Marshall's read is that this rhythm is closer to obsession than to efficiency, the linguistic equivalent of someone circling the same idea because they can't quite let it go, can't quite convince even themselves that the sanitized version is sufficient. She draws a comparison that should sit uncomfortably with anybody who remembers it. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, standing in a courtroom explaining that he'd comforted one of his victims before he killed her, presenting himself, in his own head, as fundamentally decent even in the act of describing an atrocity. Marshall's point isn't that whoever wrote this note is BTK. Her point is the psychological mechanism is the same one. Someone trying to build a bridge of sympathy toward the person they've most harmed, trying to be forgiven in the same breath they're delivering the worst possible news, because the alternative, sitting with what they actually did, unsoftened, is more than they can carry. And then Marshall raises something almost nobody had said publicly before this broadcast. The note may not have one author at all, in the sense of one hand guiding every decision. She describes an image, unprovable but worth naming, of someone standing over the writer's shoulder saying add this, add that, as the letter goes through draft after draft. It fits the evidence, in an odd way. The repetition. The layered justifications. The sense, reading it closely, that no single sentence was left alone, that everything got a second sentence bolted on right behind it just in case the first one didn't land. Marshall connects that instinct to her own experience defending a doctoral dissertation, being told to consult with roughly 30 people in her department before the defense, and then being told by her committee afterward that the finished document read like it had been written by 30 different voices stitched together. Consensus writing has a texture. It second-guesses itself in the final product even when every individual sentence reads clean. But underneath the psychology and the syntax sits a legal fact that should be ringing louder than either, and it's the fact Lisa Miller brings back to the table once Marshall finishes. Even if every word of that second note is true, even if Nancy Guthrie really did die of natural causes days into her captivity, exactly as claimed, the person who took her is still facing a murder charge. It's called felony murder. If a death occurs during the commission of a felony, kidnapping, in this case, the person responsible for that felony can be charged with murder regardless of whether they personally intended the death, regardless of whether they ever laid a hand on the victim in violence. You do not get to kidnap an 84-year-old woman, deprive her of her medication, her hearing aids, her glasses, and then claim a natural death absolves you because your hands, technically, didn't stop her heart. The law does not work that way, and in this jurisdiction, felony murder can carry the death penalty. Whoever wrote "nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome" was, whether they understood it or not, writing a line with zero legal value. It doesn't matter if the outcome was unavoidable. What matters is that the felony that produced the outcome absolutely was avoidable at every single step, starting with the decision to walk into that house in the first place. It's worth being precise about what actually happens next, legally, once a name eventually attaches to this evidence, because the process is less dramatic and more methodical than television usually portrays it. Investigators would need to present their accumulated evidence, the linguistic analysis, the blood pattern findings, the pacemaker and doorbell timeline, any printer or digital forensics recovered from the notes themselves, any Bitcoin wallet activity, to a prosecutor, who would then determine whether to seek an indictment from a grand jury on kidnapping and felony murder charges. Arizona, like the federal system, allows kidnapping cases with an interstate or federal nexus, in this instance triggered by the involvement of the FBI and the use of Bitcoin infrastructure that crosses jurisdictional lines by its very nature, to be prosecuted either at the state level, the federal level, or both in coordination. And prosecutors in cases like this often pursue whichever charging path carries the most severe available penalty and the strongest evidentiary footing. Given the felony murder exposure discussed earlier in this broadcast, and given Arizona's status as a death penalty state, whoever is eventually charged in this case faces the most serious criminal exposure the legal system has to offer, regardless of whether prosecutors can ever prove specific intent to kill. There is no statute of limitations on murder in any American jurisdiction, which means the passage of time itself, 6 months, 6 years, does nothing to close this case's legal exposure. The clock that matters here isn't a filing deadline. It's simply how long it takes for one more piece of evidence, a name behind a Bitcoin wallet, a printer's mechanical fingerprint, a phrase somebody finally recognizes out loud, to surface. It's worth stress-testing this entire body of evidence one final way by asking what a competent defense attorney would do with each piece of it if a name ever does get attached to this case, because evidence that can't survive cross-examination isn't worth much in the courtroom that ultimately matters most. The linguistic analysis, the comma splices, the open compounds, the idiolect argument, would face an immediate and predictable challenge. 2 short documents are a thin sample size, and a defense expert would argue, correctly, that stylistic quirks common enough to appear in 2 letters aren't necessarily rare enough, statistically, to single out one specific author beyond reasonable doubt without a much larger body of comparison writing from the actual defendant. The IP address evidence would face questions about who else had access to that connection, whether it ran through a shared network, a public router, a compromised device. The blood evidence would need an unbroken chain of custody and expert testimony robust enough to survive a defense expert offering an alternative explanation for the smear pattern. Even the pacemaker telemetry, powerful as it is, would need to be entered through the same kind of Fourth Amendment analysis that governed the Ross Compton case, a warrant, a chain of custody, expert medical testimony establishing exactly what the data can and cannot prove about who moved her and why. None of that means the evidence discussed tonight is weak. It means all of it, the language, the blood, the timeline, the Bitcoin address, the printer forensics, if they exist, needs to work together, corroborating each other rather than standing alone, because that is precisely how prosecutors build cases that survive trial rather than cases that only survive a cable news panel. The convergence across independent disciplines discussed throughout tonight's breakdown, linguistics and blockchain forensics agreeing, psychology and physical evidence agreeing, isn't just intellectually satisfying. It's the specific architecture a case like this would actually need in order to hold up in the one room where it ultimately has to. Miller takes the psychology further, and this is where her background interviewing violent offenders, murderers, people who'd committed the worst crimes imaginable against children, becomes the sharpest tool in the room. She's seen this exact linguistic move before, over and over, across a career of sitting across the table from people trying to explain away what they did. The passive voice isn't an accident. She perished instead of she died because of what we did. Nancy didn't perish, Miller says, correcting the letter in real time. You did something horrible by taking a vulnerable elderly woman out of the house, and you caused this. That's the gap the entire second note is built to paper over, the gap between what happened and who is responsible for it happening, and every euphemism in the letter, perished, buried in nature, heart-related, exists specifically to widen that gap just enough that the writer can live inside it. Miller adds one more layer that matters enormously going forward, and it's the piece that turns this from a psychological curiosity into an actual investigative tool: idiolect. Every person alive has one, a set of small, Individual verbal habits, word choices, and phrasings that are unique to them the way a walk or a laugh is unique to them, built out of where they grew up, who they talked to, what they read, what job trained their vocabulary. Most Americans do not casually say perished. Most Americans do not say buried in nature. Somewhere, someone in this person's life, a family member, a coworker, a friend, has heard them use one of those exact phrases before, in a completely unrelated context, and thought nothing of it at the time. That's the tip Miller is explicitly asking the public to listen for. Not a smoking gun. A phrase. A pattern of speech. Someone in your life who talks like this note reads. Before we leave the psychology of the letters and move to the physical scene, there's a second body of language in this case that deserves the same close reading, and it comes from the other side of the correspondence entirely, from Savannah Guthrie herself, in the public plea she released before the second note arrived and changed everything. Our mom is a kind, faithful, loyal, fiercely loving woman of goodness and light. She is funny, spunky, and clever. She has grandchildren that adore her and crowd around her and cover her with kisses. She loves fun and adventure. She is a devoted friend. She is full of kindness and knowledge. Talk to her, and you'll see. The light is missing from our lives. Nancy is our mother. We are her children. She is our beacon. She holds fast to joy in all of life's circumstances. She chooses joy day after day. Despite having already passed through great trials of pain and grief, we are always going to be merely human. Just normal human people who need our mom. Mama, if you're listening, we need you to come home. That statement was not written for the general public, not really, whatever its wider effect. Notice the direct address buried at the very end. If you're listening, not if anyone has seen her, not if anyone has information. The two phrasings a family typically uses when they're speaking to potential witnesses, or the person holding their loved one against her will. If you're listening is a phrase constructed for exactly one recipient, Nancy Guthrie herself, on the operating theory that she might, somehow, somewhere, be within earshot of a radio, a television, a phone held up to her by someone else. It's a statement built entirely around hope, the hope that she was alive to hear it, and it's worth remembering that this plea went out into the world before the second note existed, before she perished, was a sentence anyone outside of whoever wrote it had ever read. Savannah Guthrie stood in an anchor chair in front of millions of people and performed composure, professionally, because that is the job, while privately holding open the specific, narrow possibility that her mother might be listening to her voice in that exact moment. That is an almost unbearable thing to ask of a person, and it's worth remembering every time this case gets reduced to linguistics and forensics and cable news panels, because underneath every syntax pattern and every comma splice sits a family that had to keep functioning in public while a stranger somewhere decided, unilaterally, what came next. Consider, too, what it actually meant for Savannah Guthrie to keep showing up for work through this. National morning television is built on a specific, exhausting performance of warmth and composure, live, unscripted, hours long, watched by millions of people over their coffee, and she did that job, by every account, through the exact months this investigation has dragged through contradictory sheriff statements, an imposter arrest, a paused cadaver dog search, and a second note claiming her mother was already dead. There is precedent for what that costs a person. Other broadcasters who've had to carry personal catastrophe into a studio because the alternative, disappearing from public view entirely, wasn't available to them either professionally or, in some cases, psychologically, the routine itself becoming one of the only stable structures left in an otherwise collapsing world. None of that is offered as armchair psychology about a woman none of tonight's panelists know personally. It's offered as a corrective to how easily this case gets discussed as pure puzzle, pure linguistics, pure forensic mechanics, when at the center of every comma splice and every pacemaker timestamp sits a family that has had to keep functioning, keep working, keep parenting, keep showing up, without the single piece of information every one of them needs most, where their mother actually is and who put her there. The repetition in that statement, kind, faithful, loyal, fiercely loving, funny, spunky, clever, devoted, full of kindness, is its own kind of evidence, not of a crime but of a family trying to build a version of Nancy Guthrie so vivid, so specific, so undeniably human, that whoever was holding her would be forced to see her as a person rather than an asset. That's not an accident either. Hostage negotiators have long understood that humanizing a victim to a captor, giving them a name, a personality, grandchildren who love her, can measurably change outcomes because it becomes harder to justify continued harm to a fully realized person than to an abstraction. Whether that message reached its intended audience, whether it factored into anything that happened between February 2nd and February 6th, is unknowable from the outside. But the instinct behind it, the choice to describe her as chooses joy day after day rather than simply as our mother, was a deliberate act of communication every bit as calculated, in its own protective way, as anything found in the notes sent back in response. There's a caution worth building into this discussion before it goes any further, and responsible coverage of a case like this one has an obligation to build it in deliberately rather than let it get lost in the momentum of a compelling narrative. American true crime has a long, uncomfortable history of turning its analytical instincts on grieving family members simply because they were the ones standing closest to the microphone, composed enough, or too composed, or not composed enough, in front of a camera during the worst weeks of their lives. John and Patsy Ramsey spent years under a cloud of public suspicion in the JonBenet case, suspicion partly fueled by armchair analysis of their own grief, their own word choices, their own on-camera effect, before DNA evidence eventually pointed investigators toward an unknown male profile and away from the family entirely. Every family that has ever stood in front of a camera pleading for a missing child's return has had to do so knowing that some fraction of the audience would be studying their face for tells, their tears for authenticity, their composure for guilt, regardless of what actually happened. Nothing in the linguistic or forensic analysis laid out on this broadcast tonight points toward the Guthrie family in any capacity, and it shouldn't, because nothing about the evidence does. The blood evidence, the removed camera, the pacemaker telemetry, the vocabulary in the notes, all of it points outward, toward an unidentified author with specific, describable characteristics that have nothing to do with Savannah Guthrie or her siblings. But the history of cases like Ramsey's is worth carrying into every case that follows it, not as a suggestion that Nancy Guthrie's own children deserve scrutiny. They plainly do not based on anything in evidence, but as a standing reminder to every viewer watching this unfold that the instinct to read guilt into a grieving person's composure, or lack of it, has been catastrophically wrong before, has cost investigators years chasing the wrong people while an actual offender's trail went cold, and should never be the default lens through which the public processes a missing person's family, in this case or in any other. Direct your scrutiny at the evidence. Direct it at the vocabulary in an actual ransom note. Direct it at a sheriff's contradictory public statements. Leave the family alone to grieve in the specific, brutal uncertainty they've been living inside since the last night they saw their mother. There's a fifth voice worth bringing into this analysis, and it belongs here specifically because it cuts against the sophistication some of tonight's other experts have been willing to grant this author. Jim Clemente, a retired FBI profiler who spent his career inside the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, has gone through these same two notes line by line and arrived at a conclusion that reframes almost everything discussed so far. Not a criminal mastermind managing operational security sophisticated enough to have evaded the FBI for 6 months, but a single, inexperienced person, making the kind of mistakes that read as deliberate misdirection to an untrained eye and read as amateur hour to someone who has spent decades sitting across the table from people who actually know what they're doing. Clemente's sharpest catch is a redundancy almost every casual reader glides straight past. We have your mother, Nancy. Stop and think about who that sentence is addressed to. It's written to Savannah, her daughter. Savannah already knows her mother's name is Nancy. She does not need it clarified inside a sentence. She is the sole intended recipient of a genuinely experienced kidnapper, someone who has done this before, who understands that every unnecessary word in a ransom note is a wasted opportunity to control tone and urgency, doesn't pad a threat with information the reader already possesses. Clemente's read is that this kind of over-explaining, saying more than the situation strictly requires, is a hallmark of inexperience, not of calculation, the writing style of someone who has perhaps consumed a lot of fictional portrayals of kidnappings, movies, television, true crime podcasts, and is unconsciously reproducing the genre's conventions rather than executing an actual criminal's economy of language. He goes further, noting the notes shift between tenses in ways that don't track a coherent timeline, present tense bleeding into past tense and back again within the same short paragraph, another marker, in his professional read, of someone constructing a scenario rather than reporting one lived in real time. And then there's the detail that ties the notes directly back to the physical evidence at the scene in a way nothing else in this case does. Doorbell footage recovered from the property shows a masked figure, black gloves, a backpack, and what appears to be a holster carrying a weapon, moving near the house around the time investigators believe the abduction occurred. That backpack, according to Clemente's analysis, is identifiable, sold specifically through Walmart, a retail chain with security camera coverage, receipt records tied to payment methods, and loyalty program data that investigators can, and very likely already have, subpoenaed. Clemente's phrase for this entire pattern, the mask, the gloves, the effort to appear professional layered on top of a retail backpack traceable to a specific big box chain, is that the offender did things he thought were sophisticated, but they were not criminally sophisticated. That's a genuinely important corrective to weigh against Morgan Wright's theory that this is a calculated, deliberately misdirecting operator too skilled to have been caught yet. Clemente's counterargument is that the appearance of skill and the reality of skill are not the same thing, that plenty of offenders who evade capture for months or years do so not because they're masterminds, but because ordinary human error, momentum, and the sheer volume of leads any major case generates simply haven't yet produced the one lucky break that closes the loop. There is a tremendous amount of information in these two notes, Clemente says, and his read, on balance, is that this information points towards someone who believed he was being careful and was, in specific, ordinary, traceable ways, not. Now, let's bring in the person who's spent 30 years standing over bodies instead of reading letters about them, because forensics and psychology only tell you so much without someone translating the physical scene. Joseph Scott Morgan is a professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University, the author of Blood Beneath My Feet, the host of the series Body Bags, and a death investigator who has personally worked more than 10,000 death scenes. When Morgan looks at these two notes, he doesn't linger long on the words, hurt her. He lingers on the fact that the notes bring up the concept of hurting her at all, because in his experience, that word doesn't appear by accident. For me, that goes to the idea that they did in fact hurt her, Morgan says, and then he connects that suspicion to something the letters never mention, something the cameras happen to catch anyway, a deposition of blood on the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home, later confirmed to have trailed off down the walkway, in the exact direction investigators believe she was taken. Morgan's professional opinion, stated plainly, is that the location of that blood, originating from the area around the nose, is consistent with someone striking her in the face, likely in an attempt to force compliance. Not necessarily a fatal blow, not necessarily evidence that this is what killed her, but evidence of violence, real violence, applied to an 84-year-old woman in the doorway of her own home, in direct contradiction to a note that insists nobody ever intended to hurt her. I don't give two hoops in hell what your intention was, Morgan says, and it's hard to argue with the logic underneath the anger. She died in someone's custody. Illegal custody. That is a kidnapping, full stop, and the presence of blood at the point of abduction turns "we never intended to hurt her" from a defense into, potentially, a lie sitting right next to a truth in the very same paragraph. And this is where the case stops being only about two letters and starts being about what happened, or more precisely what didn't happen, in the earliest hours after Nancy Guthrie vanished, because evidence doesn't only live on paper. It lives on porches, on door frames, on ceramic tile, and, according to multiple people in this conversation, a meaningful amount of it may have been lost. Start with the porch itself. Video obtained by Fox News Digital shows a man walking across that same porch in the days after the disappearance, not carefully, not with any apparent awareness that he might be standing in an active blood evidence scene, but casually, the way you'd walk across your own front step. Morgan zeroes in on his feet. Ceramic tile is, in his words, a very dusty surface, the kind of surface that would hold a shoe impression clearly if it were treated correctly, locked down, protected with an electrostatic lift or Meyer sheeting before anyone else was allowed near it. Instead, according to the reporting these panelists are working from, people walked across that porch repeatedly in the days that followed, including, almost unbelievably, a pizza delivery person. Morgan's blunt verdict is that a high school forensics class would have known better than to let that happen, and it's not an exaggeration for effect. Locking down a blood evidence scene is one of the most elementary lessons in any introductory crime scene course anywhere in the country. Before we get to the back door, there's an investigative angle that deserves to be raised on its own, because it's the kind of avenue that rarely makes for dramatic cable television but statistically accounts for a significant share of elder exploitation and abduction cases: paid or informal caregiver access. An 84-year-old woman managing a pacemaker, hearing aids, and daily medication is, statistically, more likely than not to have some form of regular in-home support: a home health aide, a physical therapist who visits on a schedule, a cleaning service, a handyman, someone with legitimate, repeated, sanctioned access to the interior of that house, its routines, its security setup, and its vulnerabilities, none of which would register as suspicious to a family used to seeing that person come and go. Investigators working elder abduction and exploitation cases are trained to build a list of every person with legitimate access to a victim's home in the weeks and months before an incident, specifically because that population, unlike a random stranger, already possesses the exact knowledge this case's physical evidence keeps pointing toward: which door doesn't lock properly, where the security camera is mounted, what a smartwatch looks like on a nightstand, when the house is predictably empty. Nothing in the public record confirms whether Nancy Guthrie had regular in-home help, and nothing here should be read as an accusation against any specific category of worker. The overwhelming majority of caregivers are exactly what they appear to be: trustworthy people doing difficult, underpaid work with genuine compassion. But the absence of forced entry, combined with the precision of the camera removal and the detailed knowledge embedded in the first note's description of her bedroom, makes this exact category of person, someone with sanctioned, unremarkable, pre-existing access, one of the most statistically plausible profiles in the entire case. And it's the kind of lead that rarely generates headlines precisely because it doesn't involve a mask or a chase, only a name on a scheduling calendar somewhere that hasn't yet been cross-referenced against everything else we've discussed tonight. Then there's the back door. According to this reporting, it was found propped open, and according to Morgan's read of the scene, that is the far more likely point of entry than the front, precisely because there was no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. No broken locks. No shattered glass. If somebody got into that house without breaking anything, they either had a key, they were let in, or they came through a door that was already open, and an open back door left unexamined for too long is exactly the kind of detail that gets easier to explain away and harder to prove the longer it sits without proper documentation. Morgan raises an alternate theory worth sitting with: that whoever was seen on that porch may have been checking whether an accomplice had successfully made it to the front, watching, waiting, playing a role in a two-person operation rather than acting alone, which would mean the back door wasn't incidental. It was the entry point of a planned, coordinated abduction, not an opportunistic break-in by a stranger passing through. Then there's the camera. According to Lisa Miller, in the course of walking the porch footage, investigators noted a security camera had been removed from its mounting on the door frame. Not damaged. Not knocked loose by accident. Removed. That is not the behavior of someone improvising. That is the behavior of someone who knew a camera was there, knew what it would capture, and took the time, in the middle of committing a felony, to eliminate it before proceeding. It is, on its own, one of the single strongest indicators in this entire case that whoever did this had either surveilled the property beforehand or had some existing familiarity with it, because strangers passing by in the dark do not typically clock the exact location of a doorbell camera and disable it with the calm of someone checking off a list. Jim Clemente's read of that same blood evidence adds a layer of nuance worth folding in here, because he's described the deposition pattern on the porch specifically as consistent with what forensic analysts call a hollow smear, a pattern that forms differently than a direct impact spatter, and the distinction matters because it changes what kind of contact produced it. A hollow or void pattern in a blood smear typically indicates something or someone moved through or across the blood after it was already deposited, dragging, shifting, repositioning, rather than a single, static point of impact captured and left undisturbed. That reading doesn't necessarily contradict Joseph Scott Morgan's theory of a strike to the face causing the initial bleeding. The two are describing different moments in the same sequence: an initial injury producing blood at one point, followed by movement across or through that blood as Nancy Guthrie was one way or another, taken from that doorway toward wherever she was next. Read together. Morgan's impact analysis and Clemente's smear pattern analysis describe roughly the same story from two different forensic vantage points: violence at the threshold of her own home, followed immediately by movement. Exactly the kind of continuous, several-minute sequence the doorbell-to-pacemaker timeline already suggested. Now put the physical scene next to the sheriff's own words, because this is where accountability has to enter the conversation, and it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Sheriff Chris Nanos has, in these panelists' assessment, delivered a series of statements that don't hold together well when placed side by side. He describes the relationship with the FBI as strong, valued, long-standing, a partnership going back decades through the Southern Arizona Violent Crime Task Force. And then, in a separate interview, under a different set of questions, he describes the FBI declining the fastest available lab option. He says he had a fixed-wing aircraft fueled, staffed, and sitting on a runway, ready to fly critical evidence to Quantico, widely regarded as one of the best forensic labs in the world, the moment it was needed, through the night if necessary. And instead, he says, the decision was made to send that evidence to Florida. It's worth pausing on the phrase Nanos used to describe that FBI relationship because it names a specific piece of institutional machinery most viewers have never heard of and probably assume is more coordinated than it actually is. The Southern Arizona Violent Crime Task Force is a multi-agency partnership, county sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, and other local and federal law enforcement working under a shared operational structure specifically to handle major violent crime cases that cross jurisdictional lines. Exactly the kind of case a kidnapping for ransom targeting a nationally recognizable family becomes the moment the first note crosses state media wires. In theory, task forces like this one exist precisely to eliminate the kind of bureaucratic friction, competing labs, competing priorities, competing chains of command that can slow down a case in its most critical early hours. In practice, task force partnerships run only as smoothly as the individual relationships and shared incentives underneath them, and jurisdictional tension between a county sheriff's department, which answers to local voters and a local budget, and a federal agency operating under a completely different chain of command, different resource priorities, and often a different, more centralized set of forensic protocols, is one of the most common, least publicly discussed sources of delay and high-profile American criminal investigations. Nanos describing the relationship as valued and long-standing, while simultaneously describing a specific moment where the fastest federal lab option was apparently declined in favor of a slower, differently sourced alternative, is not necessarily a contradiction. Task force partners can disagree about specific tactical decisions while maintaining a genuinely functional overall relationship, but it is exactly the kind of institutional friction point the public deserves a plain language explanation of, rather than a reassuring generality about how long the partnership has existed. That single choice, according to the timeline laid out on this broadcast, cost the investigation real hours in the window that matters most in any missing person case. The first hours, the ones every homicide detective in the country will tell you determine whether a case gets solved in days or drags on for years. An aircraft sat on a runway from dawn until dusk. Not because the plane wasn't ready, because a decision about where to send evidence took that long to finalize, and DNA that could have started processing that same night instead sat waiting for a longer route to a different lab. When a reporter later asked why DNA was being processed across the country instead of through the fastest available channel, Nanos described an active, coordinated, nationwide effort, labs working together, thousands of tips being run down. All of that may be true. It may also be true that some of that coordination is covering for a slower start than it needed to be, and Nanos' own description of a company he has a financial relationship with, referred to on this broadcast as his pet lab with a money contract in Florida, raises a question that deserves a direct answer rather than a vague reference to labs working together across the country. Which is it? A fast, coordinated, best available resource operation, or a slower one, routed through a preferred vendor instead of the fastest lab in the country, while a plane sat fueled and idle? Those two stories cannot both be completely true, and the family and the public funding this investigation deserve to know which one is. There's also a media ethics dimension to this story that deserves honest acknowledgement, because the decision to publish the full text of a ransom note is not automatic, and different outlets and different law enforcement agencies have handled that decision differently across decades of American crime coverage. Standard guidance in many kidnapping cases leans toward withholding specific operational details, exact dollar figures, precise instructions, unique phrasing, out of a documented concern that publicizing them invites copycats, opportunists who see a real crime generating national attention and decide to insert themselves into it purely for money or notoriety. Exactly what happened here already once, with Derek Collella's fraudulent messages arriving in the same window as the authentic first.
Note:
that concern isn't hypothetical. It's already played out in this exact case. And yet the sheriff's department ultimately made the opposite choice, releasing the full text of both notes verbatim to the public roughly 6 months in, betting that the investigative value of crowdsourced recognition, someone hearing, buried in nature, and placing the phrase with a specific person, outweighed the risk of generating a second wave of copycat noise. It's a defensible bet, the same bet that broke the Unabomber case, but it is a bet made consciously with trade-offs on both sides, and it's worth understanding that every piece of linguistic analysis in tonight's broadcast, everything Lisa Miller, Bethany Marshall, and Jim Clemente have offered, exists only because that specific institutional choice was made. A different sheriff, in a different case, choosing the opposite path, would have left this exact body of evidence sealed in an evidence locker indefinitely, unavailable to the exact kind of public recognition this broadcast is built to generate. There's a question underneath all of this that hasn't been fully answered by anyone in law enforcement, and it's the most basic question a viewer can ask. Why release these two notes to the public now, roughly 6 months after they were first received, rather than at any point closer to when they actually arrived? Sheriff Nanos's own stated reasoning, offered at the time of release, was that his investigators hoped exposing the actual language of the notes to the widest possible audience would generate exactly the kind of public recognition this broadcast is built around. Someone hearing a phrase like buried in nature and placing it immediately with a specific person they know. That's a legitimate, defensible strategy, and it's the same strategy that eventually cracked the Unabomber case wide open, publishing a private voice broadly enough that someone who already knew it could recognize it. But 6 months is a long runway for that same reasoning to have gone unused, and it raises the uncomfortable possibility that the note sat in an evidence file for months while investigators pursued other leads first, tips, forensic avenues, the men who were detained and released, before circling back to the one piece of evidence that had been sitting in their possession, largely untapped for public benefit, the entire time. Go back for a moment to February 5th itself, the actual deadline named in that first note, for $1 million in Bitcoin before 5 p.m., and look at what the sheriff's department was saying in public on that exact day, because the contrast against what the note demanded is its own kind of evidence. Standing in front of cameras that same afternoon, Sheriff Nanos told reporters, "We believe Nancy is still out there," and confirmed that, as of that moment, investigators still had not identified a suspect or a person of interest. No arrest. No named suspect. No payment, so far as the public record shows, ever made. The deadline the note demanded came and went with nothing resembling the transaction the letter described, and the very next confirmed communication from whoever was behind this, 1 day later, was the second note, the one abandoning the ransom framing entirely and announcing a death instead. That sequence, deadline missed, then immediate pivot to a death narrative, is worth sitting with on its own. It's consistent with a scenario where the ransom demand was never going to be paid quickly enough, or ever, to satisfy whoever was holding her, and the second note functioned less as an honest update and more as an exit strategy, a way to abandon a plan that had already failed to produce a payment. If the claim in that second note is even partially true, buried in nature, it's worth understanding what that phrase actually means as a search problem in this specific part of the country, because the Sonoran Desert surrounding Tucson is not a uniform, easily grid landscape. It's an enormous, varied terrain of wash channels, dense mesquite and Palo Verde cover, rocky foothills, and federally managed land stretching in multiple directions from the city, much of it difficult to access by vehicle and even harder to search exhaustively on foot. Search and rescue professionals who work desert recovery cases will tell you that heat, scavenging wildlife, and the sheer scale of viable concealment terrain make a specific, undirected desert search one of the most resource-intensive, lowest probability of success operations in American search and recovery work, which is precisely why cadaver dogs, trained to detect decomposition sent across wide areas far faster than human searchers on foot, are typically the tool of first resort once a case moves from an active kidnapping search to a body recovery search. That's what makes the reported pause in cadaver dog deployment, discussed earlier in this broadcast, such a consequential detail rather than a footnote. In terrain this difficult, the tool best suited to testing the second note's central claim is exactly the tool that, according to public reporting, has not been in active, sustained use for months. Whether that reflects a resource allocation decision, a shift in investigative priorities toward the living suspect theory rather than the body recovery theory, or something else entirely, is a question the department owes the Guthrie family and the public funding this search a direct answer to. Time itself is working against every category of physical evidence in this case in ways worth naming explicitly, because 6 months is not a neutral span when the underlying evidence is biological. Blood degrades. Under direct desert sun and the temperature swings of a Sonoran summer, a bloodstain's usable genetic material can break down significantly faster than it would in a climate-controlled environment, which is exactly why the porch contamination discussed earlier in this broadcast, the pizza delivery person, the uncontrolled foot traffic, compounds in severity the longer this case has gone unresolved rather than fading in importance. Scent evidence follows a similar decay curve, which is precisely why cadaver dog searches are typically most productive in the weeks immediately following a disappearance rather than months later. Another reason the reported pause in that specific search technique carries more weight than a passing procedural footnote. Even the printer forensics and metadata discussed earlier have a shelf life of their own. Hard drives get replaced, cloud storage gets purged on automatic retention schedules, devices get reset or discarded, and every month that passes without those digital traces being subpoenaed and imaged is a month closer to that specific avenue closing permanently. None of this is offered to suggest the case is unsolvable. Cases far colder than 6 months old get solved regularly, sometimes decades later. It's offered because it explains, plainly, why the timeline questions raised throughout tonight's broadcast, the idle aircraft, the lab routing decision, the 6-month gap before the notes were made public, aren't just questions about institutional accountability in the abstract. They are questions about evidence that had a shelf life, and every day spent on the wrong process was a day drawn down against it. The search effort itself tells its own story about how this case has been prosecuted physically, separate from the linguistic and psychological analysis. In the weeks after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators deployed cadaver dogs, specialist canines trained specifically to detect the scent of human remains, initially borrowing K-9 units from the local Border Patrol office to expand search capability across the desert terrain surrounding Tucson. By roughly the 5-week mark, according to reporting on the case, that cadaver dog deployment had been placed on hold, no longer actively used as part of the search. The Sheriff's Department has not offered a detailed public explanation for that pause, and it sits uneasily next to a note claiming she is buried in nature, language that would seem, on its face, to make targeted, terrain-specific cadaver dog searches more urgent, not less. If the second note's claim is being taken seriously as a genuine lead about her physical location, a pause in exactly the search technique best suited to testing that claim is difficult to reconcile with an investigation moving at full urgency. If the note isn't being taken as a serious lead about location at all, that itself is worth knowing, because it would suggest investigators have reason to doubt its honesty that hasn't been shared publicly. Layer in the doorbell footage recovered from the property itself, which reportedly shows a masked figure in black gloves, carrying a backpack, wearing what appears to be a holster with a weapon, moving near the house around the time of the abduction, and the picture sharpens into something closer to an actual description than an abstraction. A masked figure prepared enough to wear gloves, indicating at least a baseline awareness of forensic risk, but casual enough to carry a retail backpack traceable to a specific national chain, is a portrait that fits neatly alongside Jim Clemente's read of an offender performing sophistication without fully achieving it. Every piece of physical evidence recovered so far, the backpack, the gloves, the removed camera, the propped open back door, sits on the same spectrum. Careful in some ways, careless in others, exactly the profile of a single person operating largely alone, thinking they were covering their tracks more completely than they actually were. There's also a less generous read worth naming honestly, because responsible analysis doesn't get to cherry-pick only the theories flattering to a department already facing scrutiny over an idle aircraft and a preferred lab contract. 6 months of sustained national media attention on a case this prominent generates its own pressure, and the release of new, previously undisclosed evidence at the 6-month mark has, in other high-profile investigations, sometimes coincided less with a genuine investigative breakthrough and more with the need to demonstrate active progress to a public and a family, running short on patience with a department that has, by its own admission, made real missteps in the earliest hours of this
case.
We don't have direct evidence to prove that's what happened here, and it would be irresponsible to present it as more than a live possibility. But it's a possibility the sheriff's department has done little to foreclose, and until it offers a fuller, more specific timeline of exactly when these notes were authenticated, what testing was done on them in the intervening months, and why 6 months was the moment chosen to make them public, that question is going to sit unanswered, alongside every other contradiction in how this case has been communicated to the people who have every right to a straight answer. And then there's the 24-hour contradiction we open with, because it's worth returning to now that you understand the full weight of what was in that second note. I have nothing to indicate she's dead. I don't have a body. I don't have a burial site. I don't have any note. Said on camera, to a national outlet, roughly a day before the sheriff's own department released a note stating she had died and was buried in nature. There are only a few explanations for that gap, and none of them are comfortable. Either the sheriff had the note and chose not to disclose its existence while directly denying it in response to a direct question, which would be a serious credibility problem for any law enforcement official managing a case this high-profile. Or investigators genuinely received or authenticated that second note within that 24-hour window, which would mean an extraordinarily fast turnaround on a document that, if real, is arguably the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. Either story is plausible. Neither one has been clearly explained to the public, and until it is, that contradiction is going to keep following Sheriff Nanos into every press conference he holds for the rest of this investigation. There's more to the accountability picture than the plane on the runway, and it's worth walking through the rest of it, because a pattern is more convincing than any single incident. Consider the DNA lab decision on its own terms for a moment. Nanos, in his own words, described forensic work happening at labs across the country, plural, working together, alongside a company referred to on this broadcast as his pet lab under contract in Florida. If the work genuinely was distributed across multiple accredited labs working in coordination, that's a legitimate, even sensible, strategy for a case generating an unusual volume of evidence, thousands of tips, thousands of photos and videos according to the sheriff's own account. But sensible distributed processing and a single preferred vendor with a financial relationship to the department are two very different arrangements, and the public has been given language that could describe either one, without ever being told plainly which one actually happened, or why a fixed-wing aircraft capable of reaching one of the most capable forensic labs in the country sat fueled and idle from dawn until dusk while that decision got made. Then there's the civil dimension of the story, which rarely gets the same airtime as the linguistics, but matters just as much to anyone asking whether this investigation has been run the way an 84-year-old kidnapping victim deserves. Individuals detained and questioned in connection with this case, men who were, by every public account, released without charges, have taken the formal legal step of filing notices of claim against the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the procedural precursor to a lawsuit alleging the department's conduct toward them caused harm. We're not going to speculate about the merits of those claims tonight, because we don't have the underlying detention records in front of us, and neither do you, and neither, frankly, does anyone rushing to a verdict on cable news. But the fact that this case has already generated formal legal action from people who were investigated and cleared tells you something important about the pressure this department has been under to produce a suspect, any suspect, and about how that pressure can occasionally point the machinery of an investigation at people who, in the end, had nothing to do with what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Every hour spent on a dead-end detention is an hour not spent chasing the person whose vocabulary put "buried in nature" on a piece of paper, and if this department has been burning hours on the wrong leads while a plane sat idle and a preferred lab got first call on DNA, that is not a minor procedural complaint. That is the difference between a case that gets solved in month 1 and a case that is still open in month 6, which is exactly where this one stands tonight. If you're finding this as frustrating to watch unfold as we are, that's exactly why we do these breakdowns. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one, because the accountability side of this story is nowhere near finished. Now, before we go any further, we owe you the other side of this argument, because responsible analysis means stress testing your own conclusions, not just building the most compelling story and stopping there. Morgan Wright is a cybersecurity expert, a former detective, and the founder and CEO of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, and his professional background includes training members of the FBI's CART team, the Computer Analysis and Response Team, on internet investigations, along with damage assessment personnel at the NSA, the CIA, and the FBI. When Morgan Wright looks at these same two notes, he sees something closer to a trap than a confession. His skepticism starts with volume. He draws the comparison to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, whose 35,000-word manifesto ultimately led to his identification because it contained enough material, enough distinctive phrasing, enough ideological fingerprints for someone who knew him personally to recognize his voice on the page. 284 words, spread across 2 short letters, is a different animal entirely. It's not nothing, but Wright's argument is that it may not be enough raw material to build the kind of confident behavioral profile some analysts are already constructing from it, and overconfidence in a thin sample is its own kind of investigative risk, because it can send resources chasing a profile that turns out to be wrong. Wright's second point is sharper, and it's genuinely worth sitting with even if you end up disagreeing with it. He points to the Bitcoin address embedded in both notes as evidence of sophistication rather than carelessness, arguing that anyone capable of establishing that infrastructure and consistently avoiding identification by the FBI for this long, in an era when law enforcement has successfully unmasked state-level intelligence operatives, Chinese PLA-linked hackers, Russian intelligence assets, is demonstrating a level of operational security that shouldn't be underestimated. His read on the note's unusual phrasing, USD, buried in nature, the open compounds, isn't that they're accidental leakage at all. It's that they could be deliberate misdirection, small, plantable details designed to make investigators chase a fabricated profile, a foreign national, an ESL speaker, someone with a specific idiolect, while the actual author sits comfortably outside that constructed profile entirely, watching the investigation run in the wrong direction. He raises a historical parallel that should make anyone in law enforcement pause. Earl Edwin Pitts, an FBI agent who was, in Wright's telling, investigated under a false flag operation once information started surfacing after the fall of the Soviet Union, a case where the assumptions investigators made early on turned out to be exactly wrong. He also references how the original psychological profile constructed for the Unabomber case, before Kaczynski was identified, described a blue-collar man in his 50s with limited formal education, when the reality was a Harvard-trained mathematician. Profiles built on incomplete information can be not just unhelpful but actively misleading, sending investigators in a confident, well-reasoned direction that happens to be a dead end. And his most concrete challenge is the simplest one. These notes, he argues, don't actually prove custody. There's no photograph, no article of clothing, no hair sample, no DNA testable material of any kind, only a description of a bedroom and a backyard that, in his blunt assessment, someone with even secondhand knowledge of the house could have produced. White's smartwatch, he points out, isn't even accurate. Publicly available images show the object recovered from the scene is a white Apple Watch specifically, a detail with a brand name that carries real informational value, and the notes describe it in the vaguest possible terms instead. If you wanted to prove custody, Wright argues, you would send something testable.
A swab.
A lock of hair. Something a lab could run against a known sample within days. Instead, The notes offer only description, atmosphere, and claims, which is precisely what you'd expect if the entire document exists to manipulate the investigation's direction and the family's emotional state rather than to actually prove anything. Let's pause here and take stock, honestly, of where the confirmed evidence actually ends and where interpretation begins, because a case this dense with competing expert opinions deserves a clear-eyed inventory before we go any further, not just for your sake, but for ours. Confirmed, independent of any linguistic theory. The timeline dropped off at 9:45 p.m., doorbell camera dark at 1:47 a.m., pacemaker out of range at 2:30 a.m. confirmed, blood at the point of exit, trailing down the walkway. Confirmed, a security camera removed from its mounting. Confirmed, no forced entry anywhere on the property, and a back door found propped open. Confirmed, 2 ransom notes sent 4 days apart from the same IP address, containing the specific vocabulary and punctuation patterns discussed at length tonight. Confirmed, a fraudulent, unrelated imposter arrested and separated from the actual case. Confirmed, cadaver dogs deployed, then paused. Confirmed, a sheriff's public denial of possessing a death note roughly 24 hours before that same note's existence was confirmed publicly. Everything else discussed tonight, the specific profile of the writer, whether the vocabulary reflects a foreign national or a deliberate plant, whether the writer is an inexperienced amateur or a sophisticated operator managing misdirection, whether the caregiver access theory or the geographic familiarity theory carries more weight, sits, appropriately, in the alleged and theorized category, built from trained professional interpretation of confirmed evidence rather than new confirmed facts. In their own right, that distinction matters, because the value of tonight's breakdown was never to hand you a verdict. No cable panel, no forensic linguist, no retired FBI profiler, however credentialed, gets to hand down a verdict from a studio chair. The value is in narrowing the field of plausible explanations honestly, showing you exactly which pieces of the puzzle are locked in place, and which pieces are still being argued over by people whose entire careers are built on getting that argument right, so that when new confirmed evidence does surface, an arrest, a lab match, a witness coming forward, you already understand exactly how it fits, or doesn't, into everything that's been laid out tonight. Here's the thing worth sitting with. Wright and Miller aren't actually as far apart as they sound. Both are pointing at the exact same body of evidence and asking the exact same underlying question: does this language reveal something true about the author, or was it constructed specifically to be read and misread? Miller's answer leans toward genuine leakage. Unconscious tells slipping past a writer trying to control their own voice under enormous stress. Wright's answer leans toward calculated design, a sophisticated actor planting breadcrumbs deliberately. Both positions can be tested against future evidence, and that's exactly why they were both invited onto this analysis, because a case this significant deserves competing frameworks stress-tested against each other in public rather than a single confident narrative handed to you as settled fact. Notice how the Bitcoin evidence and the linguistic evidence actually reinforce each other rather than sitting in separate silos, because it's a detail worth making explicit before moving on. The same wallet address, reused across both notes for days apart, is functioning as exactly the kind of consistency marker Lisa Miller has been building her single-author theory around from the language alone, an independent, technical confirmation running parallel to the punctuation and vocabulary analysis rather than contradicting it. A second, different author, someone genuinely unconnected to the first note, composing the death announcement independently, would have had no reason to know that specific Bitcoin address at all, let alone reuse it in a letter that no longer even asks for payment. Its presence in the second note, despite the complete absence of any renewed payment instruction, is, in its own way, as revealing as any comma splice discussed tonight, a leftover fragment from the same operational infrastructure, included either out of habit, out of incomplete revision, or as an unconscious signature, proof to whoever might eventually analyze both documents side by side that they came from the same source. Two independent evidentiary threads, one linguistic, one technical, pointing at the same conclusion from two completely different directions. is exactly the kind of convergence that gives investigators confidence to build a case around, and it's exactly the kind of convergence a defense attorney has the hardest time picking apart in front of a jury because it isn't one expert's interpretation standing alone. It's two entirely different forensic disciplines independently arriving at the identical answer. There's a technical dimension to the Bitcoin demand itself that deserves more attention than a cable panel usually gives it, because it cuts directly against the idea that cryptocurrency offers criminals a clean, untraceable getaway. Bitcoin is not anonymous. It is pseudonymous, which is a very different thing, and the distinction has ended more than one criminal career that assumed otherwise. Every transaction on the Bitcoin network is permanently recorded on a public ledger, visible to anyone, forever. And while the wallet addresses themselves don't come pre-labeled with a name, federal investigators have become extraordinarily good, in the years since Bitcoin went mainstream, at correlating wallet activity with real identities the moment that wallet touches a regulated exchange. A service that requires identity verification to convert digital currency into spendable cash. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware case, one of the highest-profile cryptocurrency extortion events in recent memory, ended with the Department of Justice recovering a majority of the ransom payment by tracing the Bitcoin's path directly through the blockchain to a specific wallet the FBI held the keys to because agents had followed the money in real time as it moved. That is the standard playbook now, and it is exactly why the fact that both Guthrie notes reportedly reuse the same Bitcoin address is such a significant detail, not because it identifies anyone today, but because it gives investigators a single, permanent, unchangeable target to monitor for the rest of this case's existence. If that address ever receives a single payment, ever gets consolidated with other wallets, ever touches an exchange anywhere in the world, that transaction becomes a permanent, time-stamped, public record connecting whoever controls it to this case. Money doesn't disappear on the blockchain. It just becomes a waiting game, and the address at the center of the Guthrie ransom demand is one investigators can watch indefinitely, for years if necessary, without the person controlling it ever knowing they're being watched until the moment they make one careless move. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because this case doesn't exist in a vacuum, and history is instructive here in ways that cut in more than one direction. Written communication from criminals has broken cases before, and it has also, sometimes, sent investigators chasing shadows for decades. The Unabomber case is the clearest example of the first outcome. Kaczynski's own brother recognized ideological phrasing in the published manifesto and came forward, ending a 17-year manhunt that had already claimed lives and injured dozens more, purely because someone who knew his private writing style recognized it once it went public. That is almost exactly the mechanism Lisa Miller is hoping plays out here. Somewhere, someone has heard "buried in nature," or "heart-related," or the exact rhythm of these repeated, justifying sentences, and simply hasn't yet connected it to this case, because until tonight, most of the public hadn't sat with these two letters closely enough to notice. Then there's a darker parallel, and it belongs in this conversation because it illustrates exactly how manipulative a communication like this can be when the sender is choosing every word for effect rather than for truth. Israel Keyes, a serial killer whose case Joseph Scott Morgan has personally discussed on this program before, sent a ransom note along with a photograph of his victim, barista Samantha Koenig, after already killing her, deliberately blurring the image so her own father couldn't determine whether his daughter was alive or dead, extracting a ransom payment for a return that was never going to happen. That case is the starkest possible warning against taking any ransom communication at face value, and it's the exact shadow hanging over the question everyone in this investigation is quietly asking: is the second Guthrie note actually true, or is it another version of the same manipulation, engineered specifically to end active search efforts, redirect resources, and let whoever is responsible fade into the background while the world assumes the case has effectively become a recovery instead of a rescue? That Israel Keyes comparison points at something the Guthrie case has been missing from the very beginning, and it's worth naming directly because it may be the single most damning fact in this entire investigation, more damning, in its way, than any comma splice or open compound. In a legitimate kidnapping for ransom negotiation, professional hostage negotiators, whether corporate, law enforcement, or private, insist on what's called proof of life before any serious negotiation proceeds. Some piece of verifiable, current information that could only come from the actual victim, alive, in the present moment. A photograph holding that day's newspaper. An answer to a question only the victim could know, generated fresh, not pulled from public records or a bedroom description anyone with knowledge of the house could produce. A recorded voice, a video, anything that proves the person being negotiated for still exists at the moment the money is being demanded. It is the single non-negotiable standard in every kidnap and ransom protocol taught by the FBI, by private security firms, by every serious hostage negotiation training program in the world, because without it, a family can pay an enormous sum of money for the return of someone who is already gone, exactly as happened to Samantha Koenig's father, staring at a deliberately blurred photograph, unable to tell whether his daughter was alive or dead, paying anyway because the alternative was unbearable. Run the thought experiment all the way through, the way a trained kidnap and ransom responder actually would have, sitting in that family's position on February 2nd with that first note in hand. Step 1, always, is verification, refusing to treat any demand as credible until the sender proves unambiguously that they control the outcome they're threatening. Step 2 is establishing a single, controlled communication channel, discouraging the family or investigators from broadcasting details publicly that could be used by a copycat, exactly the vulnerability Derek Colella exploited within days. Step 3 is buying time deliberately. Professional negotiators know that extending a timeline, rather than rushing to meet a deadline, both increases the odds of a peaceful resolution and gives investigative work more hours to produce a location or an identity, which makes the note's own 5-day deadline, in retrospect, look less like an obstacle the family failed to overcome and more like a pressure tactic explicitly designed to short-circuit exactly that kind of careful, deliberate process. None of this is offered as criticism of a family thrown into the worst week of their lives with no preparation for any of it. Nobody is trained for this. That's precisely why professional responders exist. It's offered because the gap between what a textbook response looks like and what this case's actual first 96 hours looked like, a hard deadline, no confirmed proof of life ever produced, an imposter muddying the waters within days, a fixed-wing aircraft sitting idle over an unresolved lab decision, helps explain why a case with this much genuine physical and linguistic evidence still doesn't have a name attached to it 6 months later. It was never a shortage of clues. It has been, at multiple specific, identifiable points, a shortage of the coordinated, textbook response those clues needed in order to be acted on fast enough to matter. The first Guthrie note never offered anything resembling verified proof of life. A description of a bedroom. A description of backyard damage. Details anyone with access to the house, or secondhand knowledge from someone who'd been inside it, could have supplied without Nancy Guthrie being anywhere nearby, alive or otherwise, at the moment the note was written. No photograph. No recorded statement. No answer to a private, verifiable question posed to family members specifically to test authenticity. That absence isn't automatically proof that she was already dead when the first note went out, but it is proof that whoever wrote it either couldn't produce real proof of life or chose not to, and in the world of professional kidnap and ransom response, that failure alone would have been reason enough for any trained negotiator to slow the process down immediately, to refuse serious engagement with the ransom demand until verifiable proof was produced. Whether that standard was pushed for behind the scenes in this case, whether investigators demanded it and were refused, or whether the family was left to interpret the note's emotional language as reassurance in the absence of anything more concrete, is one of the questions this case still owes the public a clear answer to. BTK stands in the middle of those two examples, because Dennis Rader's written taunts to police and media, sent over the course of decades, eventually became the very thing that caught him. A floppy disk he believed was untraceable carried metadata linking directly back to his church computer and his own name, and it ended a case that had gone cold for years. Zodiac sits as the counterexample and the warning inside the warning. Taunting letters, cipher codes, distinctive handwriting, an entire library of written material, and to this day, no confirmed identification, a reminder that words alone, however revealing, do not guarantee a resolution, no matter how confident the linguistic analysis sounds on a broadcast like this one. Two more cases belong in this conversation, and if you know anything about the history of American ransom notes, You already sense why. The first is the case that essentially created the modern discipline of forensic document examination in the public imagination: the 1932 kidnapping of the infant son of Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world at the time. A ransom note was left at the scene, followed by more than a dozen additional letters over the following weeks, each one containing distinctive, consistent misspellings: anything for anything, money for money, oddly placed symbols the writer used to authenticate each letter as coming from the same source. Handwriting examiners spent years building a case around those consistent errors, that consistent voice, and when Bruno Richard Hauptmann was eventually arrested with a portion of the ransom money in his possession, prosecutors leaned heavily on expert testimony matching his handwriting, his spelling patterns, his phrasing, to the notes. It remains, to this day, one of the most studied ransom note cases in forensic history, cited constantly by document examiners precisely because it demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that a kidnapper's own hand, freely given in a note meant to extract money rather than confess guilt, could become the evidence that convicted him. It is also, worth noting honestly, a case some modern researchers have revisited with real skepticism about whether the linguistic case against Hauptmann was as airtight as it was presented at trial, which is its own lesson. Confident forensic narratives built on written language can still calcify into certainty faster than the underlying evidence actually earns. The second case sits far closer to home for anyone who lived through the 90s as a news consumer, and it is, in some uncomfortable ways, the closest structural cousin to what's unfolding with the Guthrie notes right now. The 1996 death of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey in Boulder, Colorado, was accompanied by a 2.5-page ransom note found inside the home, demanding an oddly specific $118,000, roughly the amount of a bonus her father had recently received, a detail that immediately suggested the author had inside knowledge of the family's finances. That note became the subject of exhaustive forensic linguistic analysis for decades, examiners parsing phrases like, "We respect your business, but not the country that it serves," and "don't try to grow a brain," for clues about the author's education level, regional background, even whether the note had been written by someone attempting to disguise a female author as male. Handwriting samples from family members were compared against the note for years. To this day, despite an ocean of linguistic analysis, despite genuine forensic advances since, the authorship of that note has never been conclusively, publicly resolved to universal agreement, and the case remains open. Modern document forensics has moved well past handwriting and spelling since Lindbergh, and even since Boulder, and it's worth explaining what a typed, likely digitally composed and printed note like the Guthrie letters can still surrender to a lab, because the toolkit here is considerably richer than most viewers assume. If the notes were composed digitally at any point, drafted in a word processor, printed rather than handwritten, before being physically delivered, printer forensics becomes a live avenue entirely independent of the linguistic analysis. Laser printers manufactured after roughly 2,000 embed nearly invisible yellow tracking dots on every printed page, a grid of microscopic marks unique to that specific printer's serial number and, in many models, the date and time of printing, originally implemented at U.S. government request to combat counterfeiting, and now a standard forensic tool for tracing a printed document back to a specific device. Even absent visible tracking dots, printer forensics examiners can often identify the exact model and sometimes the individual unit that produced a page by analyzing microscopic banding patterns, toner distribution irregularities, and mechanical defects unique to that printer's rollers and drum, the print equivalent of a ballistic fingerprint left by a specific gun barrel. If either Guthrie note still exists as a physical page in an evidence locker, and there's every reason to believe it does given how thoroughly the sheriff's department has described handling it, that page is a candidate for exactly this kind of analysis, independent of anything a linguist or a psychoanalyst can offer. Beyond the physical page, if any digital trace of the note's composition survives, a saved draft, a deleted file recoverable from a hard drive, metadata attached to whatever file was sent to the television station before printing, forensic examiners can extract information most people don't realize modern documents carry silently in their code. The software used to create the file, the account name associated with the device that created it, timestamps for creation, and every subsequent edit, and In some cases, even a record of previous document titles or file paths that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside the writer's own computer. None of that has been publicly confirmed as available in this case, and there's no indication investigators have said whether the notes arrived as physical letters, printed pages, or digital files at all. But the point stands regardless of which category applies. The era in which criminal document analysis began and ended with handwriting samples closed decades ago, and if this case is ever solved through the notes themselves rather than through a human tip, it is at least as likely to happen through a printer's microscopic mechanical fingerprint or a stray line of file metadata as through any comma splice, however revealing that comma splice may be. Put those two cases on either side of the Guthrie notes, and you get the honest range of outcomes language evidence can produce. Lindbergh, a note's idiosyncratic spelling and phrasing became central evidence in a conviction. John Bonet, decades of the most sophisticated linguistic analysis available still hasn't produced consensus. Both cases involve short, information-dense documents written by someone with real or performed knowledge of the victim's household in the immediate aftermath of a crime, exactly the category the Guthrie notes fall into. Whether this case ends up closer to Lindbergh or closer to Boulder likely depends less on how clever the linguistic analysis gets from here and more on whether that analysis gets matched quickly to a real name attached to a real voice, because language evidence has never, in the history of American crime, solved a case entirely on its own. It has only ever confirmed or destroyed a suspect once one was already in the room. What almost every one of these cases shares, whether they were ultimately solved or not, is this: the offender could not stop writing, could not stop explaining themselves, justifying themselves, needing to be understood even while committing or having committed something monstrous. If the second Guthrie note fits that same psychological mold, and multiple experts on this broadcast believe it does, then the person who wrote sorry at the bottom of that letter may not be finished communicating. And every single word they've already put into the world is now permanently available for comparison against whatever they say next, publicly or privately, for the rest of this investigation. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a profile built not from speculation but from the sender's own words, cross-checked against physical evidence at the scene, and it's worth laying it out plainly one more time, because clarity is what turns a viewer into a witness. Someone with access to, or existing knowledge of, the interior layout of Nancy Guthrie's home, specific enough to describe items in her bedroom and damage in her backyard. Someone whose everyday vocabulary includes phrases most native, habitual English speakers don't reach for instinctively, buried in nature, a currency clarified as USD, open compounds where compression is the norm. Someone capable of identifying and physically removing a security camera in the middle of committing a felony, which speaks to either surveillance beforehand or prior familiarity with the property. Someone who, according to the blood evidence at the scene, was willing to use physical force to control an 84-year-old woman, whatever they may claim about intention after the fact. And someone who, according to multiple psychological readings independently arriving at the same conclusion, needed, even in the middle of extortion, to be understood as fundamentally decent, needed to apologize, needed the family to believe that nothing could have been done differently because the alternative, sitting fully inside their own responsibility, was more than they could carry. That is not a stranger who read about this family in a magazine and improvised a crime of opportunity. That is a portrait of someone closer than the public has been led to assume, someone whose voice, whose habits of speech, whose vocabulary exists right now in the memory of somebody who knows them. A coworker, a neighbor, an ex, a relative. Someone who has heard this exact phrasing before and filed it away without a second thought, because before tonight, they had no reason to think it mattered. There's a discipline within criminal investigation called geographic profiling, built on the observation that most offenders, contrary to the popular image of a criminal mastermind operating anywhere and everywhere, actually commit crimes within a fairly predictable radius of the places they already know well: their home, their workplace, a relative's house, a route they drive regularly, because familiarity reduces the anxiety and uncertainty involved in committing a crime in the first place. Investigators call it comfort zone theory, and it's one of the most consistently reliable tools in narrowing suspect pools in cases where an offender's identity remains unknown but their behavior at multiple points in a crime, entry, exit, disposal, communication can be mapped geographically. Apply that lens to what's known here. A back door left unlocked, suggesting either prior access or careful advance reconnaissance. A security camera specifically located and removed, suggesting a visit, physical or digital, to that property before the crime occurred. A ransom note delivered to a specific local television station rather than a national outlet or a federal tip line, suggesting familiarity with the Tucson media landscape, specifically knowledge of which local station would move fastest, which reporters would take the note seriously enough to escalate it. A return drop-off location described simply as back in Tucson, suggesting a holding location the writer considered meaningfully separate from the city itself, but not so far removed that a 12-hour return trip felt unrealistic to promise. Every one of those data points, independently, nudges toward the same conclusion Lisa Miller's linguistic profile already suggested. This is very unlikely to be the work of someone with no prior connection to this specific house, this specific family, or this specific city. Layer the timeline back on top of that profile and it sharpens further. 43 minutes between a doorbell camera going dark at 1:47 in the morning and a pacemaker signal losing range at 2:30. That is not the signature of a panicked, disorganized crime committed by someone improvising in the moment they realized an elderly woman was alone and vulnerable. That is a controlled, continuous sequence. Camera addressed first, victim moved second, executed inside a window tight enough that whoever was involved either planned the movement in advance or has done something like this, or something adjacent to it, enough times before that the choreography came naturally under pressure. Combine that with the removed security camera, which speaks to premeditated awareness of the property's specific vulnerabilities, and with the absence of any forced entry anywhere on the house, which speaks to either a key, an invitation, or intimate familiarity with an unlocked back door, and the emerging picture stops looking like a random predator who selected a wealthy, high-profile family off a list. It starts looking like someone who had reason to know that house, that family, and that 84-year-old woman's daily patterns well enough to plan around all three at once. Now fold the language back in on top of the timeline, because this is where every thread in tonight's breakdown actually converges into a single, coherent shape. A vocabulary that leans toward USD, buried in nature, and open compounds most habitual English speakers compress. A punctuation habit, the comma splice, the theatrical ellipsis, that repeats across two documents written 4 days apart, under two very different emotional states, calm and controlled in the first, defensive and self-justifying in the second, yet stylistically consistent in both. A psychological need, identified independently by a psychoanalyst reading motive and a former detective reading criminal behavior patterns, to be understood as fundamentally decent even while describing an act of profound cruelty. None of these threads, alone, identifies a person. Together, cross-referenced against a 43-minute window of controlled, premeditated movement and a security camera someone knew to remove, they describe a narrow, specific kind of person, not a monster from a stranger danger nightmare, but someone ordinary enough to have walked past that house, that camera, that back door, more than once before the night it mattered. So here, one final time, laid out as plainly as language allows, is exactly what to listen for in the ordinary course of your own week, because this is the part of the broadcast that actually matters more than any of the analysis that produced it. Listen for someone who says buried in nature instead of buried in the desert, buried out back, or simply buried. Listen for someone who clarifies a dollar figure as USD in casual conversation, out of habit, without being asked. Listen for someone who writes smartwatch as 2 words or floodlight as 2 words in a text message or an email you'd otherwise scroll straight past. Listen for someone who, discussing this case or any similar one, leans unusually hard into passive constructions when death or harm comes up, she perished, it happened, rather than someone did this. Listen for someone whose sentences double back on themselves, the same reassurance offered twice in a row, joined by a comma instead of a full stop, as if once wasn't enough to be believed. Watch for someone connected, however loosely, to in-home elder care in that specific neighborhood, the Catalina Foothills area, someone who would have had ordinary, sanctioned reason to know the layout of that house, the location of its cameras, the rhythm of its occupant's schedule. Watch for behavioral change in the weeks after February 1st, someone who grew withdrawn, someone who abruptly stopped talking about a topic they used to bring up constantly, someone whose financial situation shifted in ways that didn't track with their income. None of these signs, on their own, means anything. Most people who fit one or two of them are completely innocent, and jumping to conclusions about a coworker or a neighbor based on a single overheard phrase does nobody any good and could do real harm to an innocent person's life. But the combination, several of these signs clustering around one specific person you already know, is exactly the kind of pattern investigators are trained to evaluate once it's brought to them, and it is precisely the kind of pattern an ordinary person, outside of any lab, outside of any task force, is uniquely positioned to notice first, simply by having spent enough ordinary time around someone to know how they actually talk. There's a reason this kind of public, crowd-driven scrutiny has earned a real place in modern criminal investigation rather than being dismissed as amateur noise cluttering up a professional process, and it's worth grounding that claim in something more concrete than optimism. The Golden State Killer case, one of the most notorious unsolved series of crimes in American history, decades old, cold in every conventional sense, was ultimately broken not by a new confession or a new eyewitness, but by genetic genealogy, investigators uploading crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database and letting distant family connections, submitted voluntarily by ordinary people building their own family trees for entirely unrelated reasons, narrow and impossibly large suspect pool, down to one man. That technique exists today as a standard tool in cold case units across the country, specifically because ordinary people's ordinary information, submitted with no idea it would ever intersect with a criminal investigation, turned out to be exactly the missing piece professional investigators couldn't generate on their own. Web sleuths communities, amateur forensic linguistics forums, true crime podcast audiences poring over public court documents have, in case after case over the last decade, surfaced overlooked details, inconsistencies, and connections that overworked, under-resourced local investigators simply didn't have the hours to catch on their own. That's not a replacement for professional investigation, and it never should be treated as one. Reckless internet speculation has also, undeniably, ruined innocent lives in cases where amateur sleuths named the wrong person with confidence they never should have had. But applied carefully, applied to specific, verifiable linguistic patterns rather than to a neighbor's face or a stranger's social media history, the audience watching a breakdown like this one tonight is not a passive consumer of a story. It is, statistically, exactly the kind of distributed, overlapping social network that has already cracked cases every bit as cold as this one. There's a reason tip lines work even when a case looks, from the outside, hopelessly cold, and it's worth explaining plainly rather than just reciting the number and moving on, because the psychology of why people don't call is exactly what keeps cases like this one unsolved for years longer than they need to be. Most people who possess a genuinely useful piece of information about a case like this one aren't sitting on a smoking gun. They're sitting on a fragment, a phrase they overheard, a coworker who once described a body as being in nature, a relative who always writes smartwatch as 2 words in a group chat nobody thought twice about, a friend who vanished from their usual routine sometime around the last week of January and came back different, in some way hard to articulate. Individually, none of those fragments feel like enough to justify picking up the phone. People talk themselves out of calling constantly, reasoning that it's probably nothing, that they'd feel foolish, that surely someone closer to the situation would have noticed if it mattered. That reasoning is exactly backward. Investigators don't need you to solve the case. They need the fragment. They have the training, the resources, and the rest of the evidence to determine whether your fragment connects to something larger, and cases exactly like this one, thin on physical evidence, rich in language, are disproportionately solved by members of the public supplying one piece of a puzzle they didn't realize they were holding until someone asked the right question. It's worth knowing exactly where that $1.2 million actually comes from, because the structure of it tells you something about how seriously this case has been treated at every level of government and community response, not just by the family personally absorbing the loss. The Guthrie family itself has put up the largest single share, $1 million, an amount that reflects both the resources available to a nationally recognizable family and the simple, brutal calculus of what they're willing to spend for any real chance at answers. The FBI has added a separate $100,000 standard practice in federal kidnapping investigations where bureau resources are already committed, and a reward serves as an additional incentive layered on top of active casework. And a further $102,500 comes from 88 Crime, the Tucson area's long-running local crime tip reward organization, a nonprofit that has spent decades specifically building the kind of anonymous, no-strings-attached tip infrastructure this exact broadcast has been urging you to use. The second number, the one that doesn't require your name. That layered structure, family money, federal money, and a dedicated local tip organization built for exactly this purpose, stacked on top of each other, exists because every one of those parties independently arrived at the same conclusion this broadcast has been building toward for the last several thousand words, that in a case this thin on named suspects and this thick on decipherable evidence, the missing piece is far more likely to arrive through a phone call from someone who didn't realize what they knew than through any single forensic breakthrough alone. Anonymity matters here too, and it's worth being explicit that the second number, the one that doesn't require you to give your name, exists specifically because investigators know fear of involvement, fear of retaliation, fear of being wrong, keeps people silent even when they suspect something.
You do not need to be right.
You do not need to be certain. You do not even need to believe your own information is significant. You need only to make it available to people whose entire job is separating signal from noise across thousands of tips, because somewhere in that noise, in a case with this much reward money attached and this much unresolved language sitting in the public record, is very likely the exact detail that turns an open case into a closed one. Now it does. If you have heard someone in your life say buried in nature, or clarify a dollar amount as USD out of habit, or if you know anyone with any connection, however distant, to that house, that neighborhood, or that family, the number to call is 800-225-5324, or if you want to remain anonymous, 520-882-7463. There is more than $1.2 million in combined reward money on the table for information leading to Nancy Guthrie or her whereabouts, and you do not need a conviction to collect it. You do not need to be certain. You need to make the call and let trained investigators determine whether what you know matters, because plenty of people who eventually cracked cases like this one didn't realize what they were sitting on until someone else asked the right question. It's worth naming, plainly, what would actually change everything laid out tonight, because a good breakdown doesn't just build a theory, it tells you exactly what evidence would confirm it or knock it down. An arrest, obviously, resolves the largest open question, but even short of that, a handful of specific developments would immediately reorder every theory discussed on this broadcast. A confirmed match between the note's printed pages and a specific printer, traced through microscopic mechanical fingerprinting or embedded tracking data, would settle the authorship question independent of any linguistic argument entirely, and would do it in a way no defense attorney could meaningfully contest in front of a jury. Movement on the Bitcoin address, any transaction at all, even years from now, would hand investigators a permanent, traceable thread directly to whoever controls that wallet, regardless of how carefully they believe they've covered their tracks in every other respect. A recovery, whether that means Nancy Guthrie found alive somewhere the case has not yet looked, or her remains located in the desert terrain surrounding Tucson, would immediately test the second note's central claim against the physical facts of decomposition timeline, injury pattern, and location, facts a body can testify to even when the person responsible for it never says another word. And a single credible tip, someone finally placing buried in nature, or a two-word smartwatch with a specific name from their own life, would collapse the entire 6-month gap between confirmed evidence and a confirmed suspect in the time it takes for a detective to run one records check. Until one of those things happens, everything discussed tonight remains exactly what it's been from the start. The most complete, honest reading available of two documents that were never meant to survive this level of scrutiny, examined by people trained to notice what an ordinary reader wouldn't, cross-checked against a timeline built from a doorbell camera and a beating heart, and handed to you, the audience, not as a verdict but as a map, the clearest one currently available, of exactly where the next real break in this case is most likely to come from. Think for a moment about how small this entire case actually is in physical terms. 284 words. A doorbell camera's disconnection timestamp. A pacemaker's last recorded ping before it lost range. A comma splice, repeated. An open compound, repeated. A word, USD, that almost nobody says out loud in casual conversation but that someone, somewhere, apparently writes out of habit. A phrase, buried in nature, that isn't how ordinary people describe a burial. None of these things are dramatic on their own. None of them look like evidence in the way a fingerprint looks like evidence, or a security camera catching a face looks like evidence. They're quiet. They are the kind of details that require someone to slow down, to read twice, to listen for a phrase they've heard before in an entirely unrelated context, at a dinner table, in a group chat, across a break room, months before they had any reason to think it mattered. That is precisely why this case has stayed open for as long as it has, and it is precisely why it is exactly the kind of case that gets solved not by a single dramatic discovery, but by the slow, cumulative weight of ordinary people paying closer attention than they otherwise would to the way the people around them talk. There's a fair criticism leveled at coverage like this, and it deserves a direct answer rather than being waved away, because ignoring it would be its own kind of dishonesty. The criticism goes roughly like this. Cable panels and independent breakdowns turn real, ongoing tragedies into content, into hours of speculative analysis performed for an audience, applying dramatic music and rhetorical questions to a case where a real family is still living inside an unresolved nightmare, and in doing so risk generating exactly the kind of noise, false leads, amateur suspicion, misdirected public attention that can actively slow down the professionals actually trying to solve it. That criticism isn't wrong in the abstract, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing defensively. The honest answer isn't that this kind of coverage is risk-free. It's that the alternative, silence, leaving a 6-month-old case's evidence sitting unexamined in front of an audience that might contain the one person who recognizes a phrase like buried in nature, carries its own cost, a cost the Unabomber case, the JonBenet case, and the Golden State Killer case all illustrate in different ways. Cases that sit unexamined by the public for years sometimes stay unsolved for exactly that reason. The responsible version of this coverage, the version this broadcast has tried to model tonight, isn't the version that names a suspect without evidence, or turns a grieving daughter's on-camera composure into an accusation, or treats a released, cleared person of interest as guilty because a headline once used his name. It's the version that sources every claim, labels speculation as speculation, protects the innocent explicitly and by name when necessary, and directs its energy at evidence rather than at people. Whether that's enough to outweigh the legitimate risks of public true crime analysis is a fair question every viewer should keep asking of this broadcast and every other one like it, every single time. We're not going to pretend this story has a resolution tonight because it doesn't, not yet. What we have is language, carefully chosen language, sitting in the hands of people trained to read it the way the rest of us read a room. A linguist who sees a single stressed author leaking consistent tells across 2 short documents. A psychoanalyst who sees a manipulator performing sympathy in the same breath as a confession. A death investigator who sees blood on a porch that the notes conveniently never mention. A cybersecurity expert who sees a trap built specifically for people eager to believe they've found a pattern. All 4 of them are looking at the same 284 words, and all 4 of them are right about something, because that is what happens when a case is genuinely this thin on physical evidence and this thick on language. The words are the case, at least for now, and words said enough times, in front of enough of the right people, tend not to stay hidden forever. 6 months is a long time to hold 284 words in your hands and still not know their author's name. It's long enough for a doorbell camera's timestamp to stop feeling like breaking news and start feeling like a fact everyone's grown numb to. Long enough for a fixed-wing aircraft that once sat fueled on a runway to become a detail buried 3 paragraphs into a story most people have stopped reading past the headline. Long enough for cadaver dogs to be quietly stood down without most of the country ever noticing they'd stopped. That's what happens to cases like this one if the language sitting at the center of them stops getting examined, stops getting spoken out loud, stops getting placed in front of new eyes that haven't yet grown tired of it. The 43 minutes between a camera going dark and a pacemaker losing signal don't get any less significant with time. The comma splice doesn't stop being a comma splice. The word sorry, alone on its own line, doesn't stop meaning whatever it meant the day someone chose to write it there. What fades, if nobody keeps talking about it, is public attention, and public attention, in a case built this heavily on someone eventually recognizing a stranger's private vocabulary, may be the single most valuable resource this investigation has left.
Sorry she died.
3 words a family has had to carry since February, not knowing if they're the truest sentence in the entire ordeal or the cruelest lie inside it. Somewhere, someone knows which one it is. Somewhere, someone has heard this person's voice, in this exact register, talking about someone else's death as if it simply happened to them rather than because of them. If that's you, or if it might be you, don't sit on it. Subscribe to this channel to stay with this case as it develops, because we will be back with the next update the moment there's something worth telling you, and until then, don't stop listening to the people around you. The next detail that breaks this case open might not come from a lab. It might come from a sentence somebody says out loud, in your presence, this week, without even realizing what it means.